The air felt heavy and cold as I stepped into the house, a place that used to hum with life and now eerily silent. No savory aroma of a home-cooked meal greeted me. No gentle warmth wrapped around me like it once did. Instead, the stark emptiness seemed to mock me, a hollow shell where love and laughter had thrived for decades. My footsteps echoed faintly on the hardwood floor as I wandered through the familiar rooms, each corner whispering memories of a life I thought would last forever. On the nightstand in our bedroom, hers and mine for 25 years, lay a single folded letter, her engagement ring perched atop it like a discarded relic. That ring, a simple band of gold passed down from my grandmother, had once sparkled with promise when I slipped it onto her finger all those years ago. Now, it sat dull and lifeless. A symbol of a bond shattered in an instant. She was gone. Left me for another man. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly suspect, was the secret I'd carried silently beneath the surface of our ordinary life. I wasn't just Tom Davis, her dependable husband. I was a millionaire, a man who'd built a fortune she'd never even glimpsed. And now, as she stumbled into her new beginning, I'd be the one standing at the pinnacle, watching her falter. My revenge wouldn't be loud or messy, it would be quiet, calculated, and utterly perfect. This is my story, a tale of how love crumbled into bitter ashes. Not so long ago. Coming home was the sweetest part of my day. After hours spent hunched over a desk or navigating the chaos of the world outside, I'd pull into the driveway with a tired smile, knowing what waited for me. The kitchen would glow with warmth, the air thick with the scent of roasting chicken or simmering stew, Helen's hands always working magic over the stove. If the kids, Jason and Anne, weren't off chasing the neighborhood crew, I'd catch glimpses of them sprawled across the living room floor with their toys or bickering over some silly game. Helen would pause her work just long enough to greet me, her arms slipping around me in a hug that melted away the day's strain, her lips brushing mine with a kiss that felt like home itself. It was the kind of scene you'd imagine framed in a Norman Rockwell painting, simple, timeless, quintessentially American. But that life didn't come easy. Our early years were a grind. A blur of sleepless nights and scraped-together budgets. The kids were little tornadoes of need, diapers, doctor visits. Endless questions, and we poured everything we had into keeping them fed and happy. We weren't destitute, not by a long shot, but luxuries? Those waited patiently on the horizon. Our parents, shaped by their own lean years during the Depression, had drilled into us a no-nonsense practicality. Work hard, save what you can, build slow and steady. And we did. Bit by bit, we clawed our way up. 2 cars in the garage, a sprawling house with room to breathe, a few small comforts when the timing was right, it was our dream taking shape, brick by brick. By the time Helen and I hit our early 40s, we'd carved out a life most would call enviable. Jason and Anne had grown into sharp, driven kids. Finishing high school with honors and heading off to university, him to engineering, her to marketing. They'd inherited our stubborn grit, that fire to know what they wanted and chase it down. I'd watch them pack their bags and feel a swell of pride, but when they left, the house seemed to exhale its soul. Dinners shrank into hurried sandwiches or takeout from the corner deli. The clatter of family life replaced by a stillness that seeped into the walls. The house hadn't changed, same furniture, same paint, but without the kids' energy. It felt like a museum of what used to be. And Helen? She drifted too. Our Friday date nights, once sacred, dwindled to a rare outing every month or so, if that. She threw herself into volunteering at the community center, surrounded by a gaggle of neighborhood friends I barely knew. They were nice enough, I suppose. But I couldn't muster the spark to bond with them. Our lives, once so intertwined, began to fork into separate paths. Pulling into the driveway after work stopped being a relief and started feeling like a quiet defeat. I'd catch my reflection in the rearview mirror, Tom Davis, 46, staring back with tired eyes. Physically, I was fine, I hit the gym, kept the years at bay. But emotionally? I was running on fumes. After 25 years of a marriage I'd once called flawless. The closeness we'd built had frayed to threads, unraveling faster than I could stitch it back. I'd always been the type to embrace the new hobbies, new trips, new dreams, and Helen used to match me step for step. But once the kids flew the nest, a shadow settled over us. She pulled inward, and I floundered, unsure how to bridge the gap. That night, unlocking the door, I felt the weight of it all pressing down. The house looked the same, yet every detail screamed change. No sizzling pans, no chatter, just a sterile quiet. I wandered to the fireplace mantel, my eyes snagging on empty spaces where photos once stood, snapshots of birthdays, vacations, us. A small gold trinket box, where Helen kept her treasures, was gone too. Upstairs, her closet yawned half-empty, hangers dangling like skeletons. Her dresser drawers were barren, wiped clean of her presence. And then, on her nightstand, I saw it, the letter. Crisp and deliberate, with that ring glinting faintly in the lamplight. My chest tightened as I lifted it, the metal cool against my skin. I could still picture the day I gave it to her, her eyes wide with joy, our futures stretching out like an open road. Now, it was a ghost of that moment. I tucked it into my jacket and unfolded the note. Dear Tom, it began, her handwriting steady but sharp, like she'd steeled herself to carve out the words. She couldn't face me, she wrote. Couldn't say it aloud. After months, years, maybe, of wrestling with herself, she was leaving. Moving forward without me. She insisted it wasn't my fault, that we'd simply drifted too far apart. Two ships lost in the fog. But then the blow, she'd fallen for someone else, a truth she couldn't bury anymore. She'd tell the kids soon, brace for their anger, their hurt. She felt guilty, she said. Suffocated by the lie she'd lived. She was taking half our savings, a few photo albums, copies for me if I wanted, and nothing else. The house, the life we'd built, she left to me. She wouldn't return. The shame, she confessed, kept her from meeting my eyes. Maybe one day I'd forgive her, maybe we'd talk. Until then, she'd always care for me. Helen, she signed it, and that was that. A storm of emotions churned inside me, shock, betrayal, a flicker of rage, but mostly, I just felt exhausted. I sank onto the bed, the letter limp in my hands. And stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours, though it was only 15 minutes. Eventually, I dragged myself downstairs to the kitchen, yanked open the cupboard, and pulled out a dusty bottle of 20-year-old rum. I poured 2 generous shots into a glass, topped it with Coke, and downed it fast. Then another. And another. I'm not a big drinker, rum and Coke here. A beer there, but that night, I let it burn through me. Not to drown the pain, just to feel something else. She'd left on a Friday, giving me a whole weekend to stew. By Sunday night, the bottle was empty, and my mind was clear. Monday morning, before I could head out, a young woman knocked on my door, divorce papers in hand. Helen had kept her word, everything mine. Save her half of the savings. She'd walked away blind, never suspecting the empire I'd built in the shadows. See, Helen didn't know me, not fully. She saw the software engineer. The steady guy tinkering with code on the side. She didn't know I'd founded a company 20 years back, starting in our cluttered garage while she slept upstairs. Robotic software, cutting edge. Lucrative, had grown into a $40 million deal, a sale I'd planned to finalize soon. I'd dreamed of surprising her, selling the house, whisking us off to Hawaii or Paris, a fresh start. But she drifted too far, and now those plans were ash. She thought she'd left me broken, but that Friday, I mourned her for all of 15 minutes. Then I called my brother Carl, my lawyer and confidant, and met him for coffee. "She's giving it all up, Tom," he said, flipping through the papers, disbelief in his voice. "Sign it and let her go. Any chance you'd reconcile?" I laughed, bitter. "You read the letter, Carl. What do you think?" I scrawled my name across 3 copies, decisive. "Send these to her lawyer fast, before she realizes what she's losing." Carl nodded, smirking. "If her new guy catches wind of this, she might come crawling back." Let her try, I thought. She'd traded a fortune for a stranger, and I'd savor the irony from afar. The kids called soon after. Jason first, his voice tight. "Dad, is it true? Mom's with someone else?" I sighed. "Yeah, son. Papers are signed. 90 days, and it's done." He fumed, wanted to confront her. But I urged him to hold back. "She's still your mom. Figure out what you want with her." And was next, her anger colder, resolute. "I'm done with her, Dad. She doesn't get to do this and keep me." I felt a pang of pride but softened it. "She's still your mother, Anne. Think it over." Over the next 3 months, I half expected Helen to show up, pleading, but she never did. And the strangest part? I wasn't even angry, just ready to rise from the ruins she'd left behind. The realization crept in slowly, a nagging whisper in the back of my mind. As I stood in the quiet of my office, staring at the papers Carl had just dropped on my desk. 25 years of marriage, 2 kids, countless sleepless nights. And a lifetime of shared struggles, now reduced to a stack of legal documents, stamped and final. I couldn't fathom why my thoughts had drifted to her with someone else. Picturing Helen laughing in another man's arms. It wasn't rage that bubbled up, though, it was a faint pang of sadness, soft and fleeting, like a breeze brushing past before vanishing into the ether. By the time Carl handed me those papers, finalizing the divorce, that ache had already dissolved, leaving behind a strange, hollow calm. I was a single man now, untethered. With an ex-wife out there somewhere in the sprawling city, living a life I no longer recognized. 95 days had slipped by since I'd stumbled into our empty house. The silence screaming louder than any argument we'd ever had. That was the day I'd pieced it together, her absence, the missing pieces of our life, the betrayal I hadn't seen coming. Standing there. I'd felt the weight of it settle into my bones, but I didn't crumble. Instead, I'd picked up the phone, my fingers steady as I dialed a number I'd been itching to call for weeks. "Bill. Are we ready to close yet?" I asked, my voice even, betraying none of the storm inside. His response was swift, eager, "Yes." We set a meeting for the next morning. And I could hear the grin in his voice, the anticipation of a deal nearly a year in the making. Bill, the silver-haired CEO of Omega Software Solutions, had been circling my company like a hawk since before Helen walked out. After she left, I'd made him a promise: once the divorce was done, I'd sell. And now, here we were. By noon the next day. The ink was dry, and I was a wealthy man, $27 million in assets, after taxes, tucked neatly into investments and cash accounts. I sat back in my chair, the leather creaking under me, and let the number sink in. It was surreal, a fortune born from the ashes of a life I'd spent decades building. But Bill wasn't done with surprises. He leaned across the conference table, his sharp blue eyes locking onto mine, and dropped a bombshell. "Tom, I don't know what you've got planned next, but hear me out," he said, his tone warm but deliberate. "I've told my board I'm stepping down as CEO at year's end. I'll stay on as chairman, 66 is enough for me to ease up a bit. I want someone fresh to take the reins, and I think you're the guy. I know it's unusual, someone from an acquisition stepping into the top spot, but it's not unheard of. You'd need to relocate to Sonoma, gorgeous place, West Coast, wine country. Think it over. The salary's solid, benefits are top-notch, and you already know our growth plans. Give me a call if you're intrigued, I'd love to dig into this with you. I blinked, stunned. My mind racing to catch up. Omega was a $300 million powerhouse, nestled in California's rolling vineyards, a place Helen and I had once dreamed of settling after the sale. I'd pushed that fantasy aside when she left, but now it roared back to life, vivid and tempting. That evening, I wandered through my house, now a cavernous monument to a past I couldn't reclaim, my footsteps echoing off the hardwood. The rooms brimmed with memories. The scuff marks on the laundry room door where we tracked the kids' growth, pencil lines climbing higher each year, the kitchen table where we'd laughed over spilled cereal. The backyard where Jason and had chased fireflies on summer nights. Those joys felt like they belonged to someone else now, distant and faded, yet the house still hummed with their presence. The choice crystallized in my mind as I stood there, staring at that doorframe. "Bill," I said into the phone later that night, "when can I fly out to talk about your offer? I'd like to see Sonoma. Meet your team." We settled on the following week, and I'd spend 7 days soaking in the place before deciding. My kids had mixed feelings about it. Jason, fresh out of college with his engineering degree, furrowed his brow, uncertain about me uprooting everything. And, nearing her own graduation, bubbled with excitement. Her voice bright over the phone. I hovered somewhere in between, a stew of nerves and possibility simmering in my chest. I hadn't told them about the sale yet, only that they should check tomorrow's business section or Google Omega to figure out why I was considering this leap. They groaned at the suspense. But I savored it, a rare moment of playful control. Sure enough, the next morning, the newspaper's business page splashed the news across its front, the $40 million sale. A photo of Bill and me shaking hands, assurances that Omega would keep operations local. I'd insisted on including the price, Bill had balked, but I think he got it. The divorce had finalized just 2 days prior, and I wanted the world to see this chapter close and another begin. The paperwork had been ironclad, a clean break with no room for revisions. And I was free. A few days later, I reclined in first class on a Boeing 767, the hum of the engines lulling me as we soared toward San Francisco International. 6 days divorced. And the world felt electric, every woman I passed seemed to glow with allure. I'd always had a thing for airline attendants. Their crisp uniforms and easy smiles sparking some boyish fascination decades ago. Now, closer to my age, they still stirred something in me, a flicker of proof I wasn't as numb as I'd feared. 3 months without intimacy had left me restless, alive in a way I hadn't expected. That afternoon, I sat across from Bill and his team in a sleek Sonoma office. Sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. We talked strategy, probed each other's visions, and I could feel the mutual respect building. Near the end, Bill ushered me into his office, closing the door with a soft click. "Tom," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I had dinner with the board last night. They're all in. We think you're the one for this. We're offering a 5-year contract, starting at $1.4 million a year. Bonuses could hit 50% for hitting targets, up to 200% if you blow us away. Full benefits. Your pick of a company car, swap it every 2 years, and there's an executive condo in Sonoma you can use if you want. It's a lot, I know. I've got another meeting tonight, or I'd take you to dinner. Let's plan that for later this week while you're here." I nodded, my throat tight. 5 times my old salary, plus bonuses that could dwarf it, it was staggering. At 46, I wasn't ready to coast. Sonoma's golden hills and crisp air promised a life I could sink into. Back at my Napa hotel that night, I paced the room, the offer buzzing in my head. The next day, I called Bill. "I'm in," I said. And his laugh crackled through the line, warm and triumphant. He'd step down December 31st, 3 months away, and I'd start as a senior consultant in the interim, easing into the role. The Sonoma condo was a sleek haven, and I'd move in 3 weeks. For the rest of that trip, I lost myself in wine country's charms, vineyards stretching to the horizon. The tang of oak barrels in the air. I'd never been a wine guy, but sipping a bold red at a bar that night, I figured it was time to learn. As the glass sat heavy in my hand, my thoughts drifted to Helen. Who was she with now? What had driven her away? Had our life, 2 kids, a mortgage, the grind, really been so unbearable? I'd dodged those questions for months, shielding myself from the sting. I wasn't drowning in grief, but I hadn't let go either. A quiet ache bloomed in my chest, not for her, exactly, but for the partnership I'd lost. With my new wealth and status, meeting women wouldn't be hard, success drew them like moths to a flame. I'd never thought myself the type to snag someone extraordinary, but maybe now I could. Back home, I tackled the logistics of moving west. I called Jason and Ann, spilling the news about the CEO gig. Jason hooped, floored by the opportunity once he dug into Omega's stats. Ann, ever the optimist, cheered me on. They'd seen the sale in the papers and knew I'd landed on my feet, though I kept quiet about their own windfalls from it. Jason, with his new degree, was carving his path, and, set to graduate in December, had nabbed a job at a local firm. But then came a twist. During pre-employment checks, she'd run into Helen's new partner, a slick guy working at the same company. The coincidence gutted her. She'd stormed out, quitting on the spot, and unloaded her fury on her mom and the guy. I didn't pry, but I felt her hurt like it was my own. The house went up for sale the next day. The kids mourned it. Those walls held their childhood, but they understood. Paid off and worth a fortune. It was time to let go. They took what they wanted. I kept the laundry room door, its notches a relic too sacred to leave behind. A week later, a strong offer came in, and I told the realtor to take it. Anything we didn't claim would be donated. I asked Jason to let Helen grab whatever she wanted, but I didn't check if she did. I was already halfway out the door. Before I left, I stopped by my old office. Word had spread, I was the new CEO of the parent company, and the team greeted me with grins and handshakes. We'd cross paths again, but that day, I just wanted to soak in their camaraderie. I ordered pizza and beers, and we lounged in the break room, swapping stories until the light faded. 3 weeks later, I was back on a plane. 122 days since Helen's exit, bound for a fresh start. The consultant gig fit like a glove, time blurring as I settled into the condo, its modern lines softened by the few keepsakes I'd brought. By the holidays, I'd found a rhythm, but it was strange without family. Usually, my brother Carl, his wife, and their kids would swing by, or we'd trek to their place. This year, I called the kids to hash out plans. Flying everyone to Sonoma felt off, so Carl and I settled on Thanksgiving at his house, with Jason and Ann tagging along later to visit me. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, a bridge to whatever came next. As Christmas loomed on the horizon, and caught me off guard one crisp afternoon with a question that stirred a quiet ripple of surprise in my chest. She wondered if she could bring a friend along to meet me during the holidays. The idea tugged at me, not with unease, but with a gentle curiosity. If this friend mattered enough for her to ask, then perhaps it was time for our worlds to intersect. I'd already met Jason's ragtag crew of buddies over the years, their loud laughter and easy banter filling my home on more than one occasion. That felt familiar, almost routine. But Anne? My daughter was different. At 21, she stood on the cusp of her own life, no longer the little girl who'd clung to my hand. The thought of her stepping into adulthood with someone new by her side made me pause, a faint ache of pride mingling with the strangeness of it all. Thanksgiving had unfolded like a warm, golden thread just weeks before. The house buzzed with the clatter of plates and the rich aroma of roasted turkey, and we'd all leaned into the joy of it, Jason cracking jokes, Anne's soft smiles lighting up the room. Yet beneath the surface, I felt a subtle current pulling at her. Her eyes lingered on me sometimes, hesitant, like she was weighing whether to voice something heavy. I suspected it was about her mother, a topic I'd grown skilled at dodging, a wound I kept tucked away behind a wall of silence. She didn't push, though. "All right, we can talk at Christmas," she'd said, her tone light but edged with resolve, before letting it drop. I exhaled, relieved, and let the moment slip away into the hum of the holiday. A few days after I'd settled back into the rhythm of home, life threw me a small curveball. I was trudging up the steps to my condo, arms straining under the weight of 2 overstuffed grocery bags, when the paper of one gave way with a sharp rip. Cans of soup and a carton of eggs tumbled onto the concrete, rolling in every direction like fugitives making a break for it. I muttered a curse under my breath and crouched down, fumbling to gather the chaos, when a shadow fell across the mess. I glanced up. And there she was, dark hair streaked with blonde highlights that caught the fading daylight like a halo, her skin kissed by a golden tan that screamed California summers. Her smile hit me like a wave, wide and radiant, framed by a bold slash of red lipstick. For a fleeting second, I could have sworn I'd stumbled into some sun-drenched beach flick, even though the nearest coast was hours away. She was striking, fit, poised, and effortlessly attractive in a way that made my tongue falter, a sensation I hadn't felt in years. "Hi, I'm Janet Carr," she said, her voice warm and steady as she crouched beside me. "I live next door. Let me give you a hand." Her friendliness disarmed me, and I managed a quick introduction as we worked together, scooping up apples and wrestling a loaf of bread back into order. We hauled the salvaged goods to my kitchen counter, and after the last can was stacked, I offered her a drink out of gratitude. She opted for a glass of wine, and soon we were perched on stools, the clink of our glasses punctuating an hour of easy conversation. She was 42, recently divorced, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd rebuilt her life from the ashes. Her ex, a slick entertainment lawyer from LA, had cheated, and in the fallout, she'd walked away with a condo and a hefty alimony settlement that left her comfortable, millions lining her independence. She'd returned to her roots here, where her parents owned a vineyard and winery just a stone's throw down the road, a legacy she'd inherit someday. "So, Tom," she teased, swirling her wine with a playful glint in her eye, "were you the troublemaker, or was it your wife who stirred the pot?" I chuckled, the sound loosening something tight in my chest. Trouble? Me? I'd always been the steady one, or so I thought. I gave her the short version of my story, no dramatic scandals, just life's quiet ebbs and flows, and we raised our glasses again, toasting to the messy, unspoken tales that linger between strangers. Before she left, I surprised myself. After 25 years of keeping my evenings to myself, I asked her out. There was this spot I'd been escaping to lately, a cozy joint with a killer jazz band, and they were playing the next night. Dinner, drinks, maybe some dancing. She agreed. And I felt a flicker of something I hadn't in ages, anticipation. When I picked her up, Janet stole my breath all over again. She'd traded the highlights for her natural brown, her hair cascading in soft waves, and slipped into a short, dark blue dress that hugged her frame just right. Slim, elegant, beautiful, she radiated a quiet allure. I'd splurged on a Porsche 911 Carrera when I moved here, a sleek silver machine I adored, and as I held the door for her, she grinned. "I've got one of these too, a red one." I laughed. The coincidence sparking a lightness between us. Dinner was a triumph, plates of seared salmon and roasted vegetables, the wine flowing as freely as our conversation. The jazz band hummed with soul. And we hit the dance floor, moving together with an ease that surprised me. Her laughter rang out as I spun her, and for those hours, time melted away. At her door, I thanked her for the night. My voice softer than I intended. She looked up, a shy smile tugging at her lips. "I had fun too. Want to do it again sometime?" My yes came without hesitation. Back at my place. I poured a rum and soda, sinking into my armchair with a contentment I hadn't known in years. The night replayed in my mind, her smile, the music, the way she'd made me feel alive. Then, 15 minutes later, the doorbell chimed. There she was again, Janet, her eyes bright with mischief. I wasn't ready to call it a night, she confessed, stepping inside with a burst of energy. "TV's rubbish anyway, thought we could have some fun." I grabbed a couple of gag gifts I'd stashed away, silly trinkets from a friend, and we dissolved into laughter. The hours slipping by in a blur of joy. When I woke the next morning, she was gone, but a note waited on the counter, "Thanks for an amazing night." I grinned, tracing the words with my finger. She'd cracked something open in me, a longing for connection, a spark of youth I thought I'd lost. Could it be her? Time would tell. Christmas crept closer, and the kids arrived like a whirlwind. Jason rolled in first with Christine, a sweet girl with a quick wit who fit right in. I murmured to him to keep the music on and the door shut, our little code for privacy, and he nodded with a smirk. And showed up the next day with Steve, a polite, charming guy who shook my hand firmly. I liked him instantly. Later, and pulled me aside, her voice low but steady. "Dad, I'm with Steve." "Like? Really with him? I need you to be okay with that." Her eyes searched mine, and I squeezed her shoulder. "I am, sweetheart. I'm happy for you." They claimed the third bedroom. And suddenly my quiet condo thrummed with life. That Saturday, Janet called with an idea, wine tasting at her parents' vineyard, maybe dinner too. I mentioned the kids and their partners. And she didn't miss a beat. "Bring them. I'll call Mom, she'll set up extra tables. They host this every year before Christmas, last time, we had 50 people. I'd love to meet your kids." Jason and were game, though Jason grinned slyly. "So, Dad, you're dating now?" Anne's gaze flickered with something I couldn't place, confusion? Disapproval, but I brushed it off. "We've been out a couple times," I said casually. "She's good company. I've missed that." Jason clapped my shoulder. "Good for you, Dad. Finding joy in the chaos." And smiled too. But it didn't reach her eyes. I filed it away for later. The vineyard was alive that night, 60 people at least, laughter echoing over the gravel lot. The kids drove my car, and I rode with Janet. Her excitement palpable. "I've been dying to introduce you to Mom," she said. "She's nosy about who I date, didn't love my last guy, but she'll adore you." I smiled, though a pang hit me. Lost my mom a few years back, right after Dad. Rough stretch, but the memories keep me going. She squeezed my hand, and we pulled in, the kids trailing behind. Introductions flew, Janet's mom. Warm and sharp-witted, sized me up with a grin, before Janet slipped away to help with dinner. I wandered into a chat with two women from a local business incubator, their energy magnetic. One, Dana, pressed me to visit their setup, and I found myself agreeing to lunch, caught up in their charm. Across the room, I caught Janet laughing with a guy, tall, eager, leaning in too close. A twist of jealousy flared, unbidden. Did they have history? I shook it off. She wasn't mine to claim, but the feeling lingered. Dinner settled things. We sat with two couples and that same guy, who monopolized her attention. I turned to the others, David Stone, a Tennessee transplant running Phoenix Financials, and Nigel and Pam Hegland, the latter Janet's cousin and a wine expert. David's firm was tied to my new office building, a detail that intrigued me. The night rolled on, rich with wine and stories, and though Janet's orbit shifted, I felt the pull of something real taking root, between us, and within me. The dinner I attended turned out to be a bustling affair, teeming with opportunities to forge new business ties and expand my network. Amid the clinking glasses and murmured conversations, I found myself seated next to Janet, a woman whose presence carried a quiet confidence. Beside her was a man named Art Shack, someone I'd never met before that night. Later, as the evening unfolded, Pam, Janet's sharp-witted cousin with a knack for storytelling, leaned over with a mischievous glint in her eye and revealed that Art and Janet had once been an item. It was a fleeting romance, she explained, sparked in the aftermath of Janet's divorce but fizzled out just as quickly. Pam's amusement as she shared this tidbit struck me as peculiar. Her laughter danced on the edge of something unspoken, leaving me to wonder what lingered beneath her playful tone. As the night drew to a close, I found myself face to face with Janet's mother. A woman who exuded the kind of warmth that felt like stepping into a sunlit kitchen on a chilly day. Her old-fashioned Italian charm enveloped me, her smile crinkling the corners of her eyes. Her voice soft yet firm with a lilting accent. Even if the rest of the room had cast me aside, I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd have welcomed me with open arms. That brief encounter left a quiet glow in my chest, a sense of belonging I hadn't expected. Before heading out, I also struck up a conversation with David and Nigel, two avid golfers whose enthusiasm for the sport mirrored my own. Over shared tales of fairways and bunkers, we hatched a plan to hit the greens together the weekend after New Year's, a small promise of camaraderie to carry into the coming year. Later that evening, Janet and I slipped away from the crowd, carving out a pocket of time just for us. The air between us felt charged with something tender and unspoken. I savored every second, the way her laughter lit up the dim room, the brush of her hand against mine as we talked late into the night. When exhaustion finally claimed us, we sank into a restful silence, the kind that blankets you like a soft quilt. Morning arrived with the rich, savory aroma of sizzling sausages wafting through the air, mingling with the sweet tang of homemade English muffins slathered with marmalade. Janet appeared at my bedside balancing a tray, her hair tousled from sleep, her smile as warm as the meal she'd prepared. Crumbs scattered across the sheets as we ate, but she didn't mind. And neither did I. When we finished, we lingered in a moment that felt like a gift, quiet, intimate, and utterly ours. I couldn't imagine a more perfect start to the day. Afterward, I thanked her with a kiss on her forehead, and we freshened up with a shared shower, the steam curling around us as we laughed about nothing in particular. As I stepped into the living room, still basking in the morning's glow, I reminded Janet about the guests I'd invited over later. She nodded, understanding without hesitation, and mentioned she'd be meeting Pam for lunch. The kids, Christine and Stephen, were sprawled across the room in their rumpled pajamas, munching on cereal and trading sleepy banter. Surveying the scene, I felt a twinge of relief that I'd spent the night elsewhere. The casual chaos of youth wasn't quite my pace anymore. Christine caught my eye. Her outfit, a sleek sweater and jeans, making her look startlingly mature. I muttered something about how grown-up she seemed, feeling every bit the stereotypical dad. Before excusing myself to check on a few things in my room. When I returned, the space had transformed, the clutter was gone. And everyone had swapped their loungewear for clothes suitable for a quick errand run. I chuckled, memories of my own messy, carefree days flickering through my mind. That afternoon, we turned our attention to Christmas decorating. I'd hauled out boxes of ornaments from our old house, tangled lights, faded baubles, and a few treasures too sentimental to toss. The condo association had strict rules about exterior displays, but they'd already decked the grounds with tasteful garlands and twinkling lights, so we focused indoors. The kids popped open a couple of champagne bottles, the fizz echoing through the room as we strung lights and hung tinsel. It wasn't the grandeur of Rockefeller Center, but the cozy glow of our handiwork filled me with quiet pride. I dragged out bags of wrapped gifts, shiny paper crinkling under my fingers, and arranged them beneath the tree. Then draped stockings along the mantel, their embroidered names catching the firelight. There were presents for everyone, even Christine and Stephen, though Christmas was still 3 days off. The scene felt like a snapshot of joy, fragile but real. Later that evening, Anne and I stepped out for a walk, the crisp air biting at our cheeks. She broke the silence first. Her voice tentative yet weighted. "Dad, have you ever thought about talking to Mom about what happened?" I turned to her, catching a shimmer in her eyes, maybe from the cold, maybe something deeper. Her question tugged at a thread I'd long buried. "You know how your mom left, Anne. No goodbye, no note. I haven't seen her since, haven't even heard her voice. I don't have her number or where she's living. And truthfully, even if I did, I'm not sure I'd call. What's on your mind?" She hesitated, then pressed on. "Dad, things aren't always what they seem. I used to see her so differently, especially after I found out everything. You remember that job I took and quit right after the divorce? That same day. The papers ran the story about you selling the business. She and that guy looked so happy together, but we didn't know the half of it." I stopped walking, searching her face. "What happened, Anne?" She took a breath, her words spilling out like a dam breaking. "He let her down, Dad. Left her with nothing but the money she'd stashed away before she walked out on us. She kept it hidden so he couldn't touch it. She's okay now, stronger than you'd think. She's got a story worth hearing. I told her I might tell you, and she begged me not to. But I said it wasn't her call anymore." My stomach churned, a mix of anger and curiosity bubbling up. "You've got me hooked now, Anne. I won't rest until you tell me everything." She sighed, grabbing my hand and pulling me to a nearby bench. "Okay, Dad, but no interruptions." I nodded, and she launched into the tale. When she finished, I sat there, stunned. The weight of her words pressing against my chest. This was my daughter, laying bare a truth I hadn't seen coming. "Do you believe it?" I asked. She met my gaze, unflinching. "Yes, Dad." I saw the black eyes, the bruises. "She won't report it, no matter how much I begged. Now she's living in an apartment by Waterside, working at the outplacement center where she used to volunteer. She's hurting, Dad, deep down. And she's my mom, I have to care." I reached for her hand. "You should care, sweetie. She's your mother. I'm struggling to process this, but if you believe her, I'll try to." Our problems didn't start recently, though, they go back years, to when you left for college. Little cracks turned into chasms. "I've told you and Jason everything. If you give me her contact info, I'll see what I can do, for you. But about reaching out? I waited 3 months for her to walk back through that door. She never did. Since then, I've tried not to look back, except to stay close to you and your brother. So no, I haven't thought about it." I pulled Anne into a hug, brushing away the tears streaking her face. And we trudged back to the condo. Inside, The other kids had popped popcorn and settled in for a movie, the room alive with their laughter. We joined them. The flickering screen casting shadows across our makeshift family night. Sleep eluded me that night, and story looping through my mind like a restless ghost. At dawn, I called my brother Tom. Voice hoarse from sleeplessness, and asked for a favor, one I'd pay handsomely for. I wanted him to dig up everything on Helen and the man she'd left with, family ties, work history, credit reports. The works. I didn't care how he got it. It's a tall order, he said, but it's doable. Just don't ask questions. That was enough for me. Christmas came and went, followed by New Year's. Janet and I spent the holidays together, the kids drifting back to their lives. One evening, as we lounged on the couch, she nudged me gently. "Tom, what's eating at you? You've been off." She knew me too well. I spilled it all, and story, my tangled feelings, the need to sort things out for my daughter's sake. "Why's it so hard?" she asked. "Go back there, talk it out face to face. You've never done that, and you won't move on until you do, if that's what you want." Her words hung there, sharp and true. I did want more than just fleeting moments with Janet. I felt a bond growing. Steady and real. Closure was the missing piece. The next morning, I booked a flight. As I headed to the airport, Carl called, Tom's guy, saying he'd emailed me files on Helen's new partner. They landed in my inbox just before takeoff, and I pored over them mid-flight. Waterside was a shiny new complex in the concourse, not luxurious but pricey enough to draw a certain crowd. I couldn't fathom Helen trading our sprawling 5-bedroom home, with its wide lawn and wraparound porch, for this. How could she leave it all behind? Yet there I was, 7 p.m. staring at the door of 1792 Fairing Lane. I'd called her earlier, testing the waters. She'd invited me for dinner, but I declined. I wasn't here to eat. When she left, she'd taken half our savings. Nearly $600,000. Ifan was right about her stashing more. She could stretch it out, especially with a job. I almost walked away, but Janet's voice echoed in my head. I knocked. Helen opened the door, and we stood there, silent, the years stretching between us. She invited me in, her apartment sparse but tidy. She wore gray slacks and a dove-patterned shirt. Pearl earrings glinting softly, a silver necklace resting against her collarbone. She looked like the woman I'd married, just a little worn around the edges. "Thanks for coming, Tom. Rum and coke?" I nodded, watching her move to the kitchen with the same grace I remembered. She handed me the drink, and we sat, circling the elephant in the room. 7 months had passed since she'd walked out. And here we were, sipping drinks like strangers pretending at familiarity. That difficult Friday lingered in my mind like a storm cloud that refused to drift away. A day that rewrote the course of our lives with a cruel, unyielding hand. I reached into my coat pocket, my fingers brushing against the crinkled edges of the letter she'd left behind. Pulling it out. I unfolded it carefully, the faint scent of her perfume still clinging to the paper, a ghost of what once was. As I began to read, I stole a glance at Helen across the table. Her face, once so resolute and composed for this meeting, faltered. Her eyes flickered with uncertainty, and I could see the courage she'd painstakingly gathered start to crumble, piece by fragile piece. Like a sandcastle succumbing to the tide. I traced her words with my eyes until I reached the final lines, asterisk, until I can face you again, know that I will always love you. Asterisk, my throat tightened. And I couldn't bring myself to finish that sentence aloud. Instead, I set the letter down gently on the table, the paper whispering against the wood, and turned to her. The question burning in my chest wasn't the one she might have expected, not some philosophical musing about regret or alternate paths. No, it was simpler, rawer. "Helen," I said. My voice steady but laced with an ache I couldn't hide. Are you willing to tell me everything? The whole truth? She looked at me, her brow furrowing as she tried to decipher my intent. Then something shifted, her composure cracked, and a tremor ran through her. Tom, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, 1,000,000 times a day since that Friday. I've wished I'd done it all differently. Honestly, I wish I'd never left at all. Writing that letter, walking out like that, it's a weight I'll carry forever. I don't think I'll ever forgive myself for it. And it's not just that, I can't stop wondering what everyone else thinks of me now, how they see me after all this. I nodded slowly, letting her words settle between us like dust after a collapse. Helen, I talked to and over the holidays, I admitted, watching her eyes widen slightly. She told me a lot, things you and I used to talk about, things about us, and even bits of your new life. Don't be upset with her, though. I pried it out of her because it was eating at me. It was straining what little connection we still had, and I needed to know. But hearing it secondhand isn't enough. I need it from you, straight from your heart. Are you willing to lay it all out for me? She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the stem of her wine glass. I'll tell you everything, Tom, if that's what you want, she said finally, her voice trembling with resolve. But I'll need more than this to get through it. She reached for the bottle of wine, pouring a generous amount into both our glasses. The deep red liquid glinting under the dim kitchen light. I guess I should start somewhere, but I don't even know where the beginning really is. For now, let's go back to that Friday when I walked away. I leaned back in my chair, the worn wood creaking beneath me, and fought the urge to interrupt. My instinct was to jump in, to tell her what I thought the starting point should be, but I bit my tongue. This was her story to unravel, her truth to untangle, and I owed her the space to do it her way. She took a slow sip of wine, her gaze drifting to some unseen horizon, and began. I wrote that letter 4 times, you know, she said, her voice softening with the weight of memory. I tore up 3 drafts before I settled on the one you're holding. Each time, I tried to find the right words, but they never felt honest enough, never heavy enough for what I was doing. If I could turn back time, Tom, I'd shred every plan I made that day. I'd stay home, waiting for you, instead of chasing some new beginning I thought would save me. Back then, it felt like a fairy tale, a shimmering promise of hope and happiness, like one of those stories where a dashing prince sweeps a restless princess away from a life that's gone stale. But looking back now, I see how childish it was, how naive. Reality crashed into me like a cold wave, and it changed everything I thought I knew about life. She paused, her lips pressing into a thin line as if she could still taste that bitter awakening. If my mother were still alive, she'd have been furious with me. She'd have shaken her head and said I threw away a treasure most people spend their lives searching for. And she'd be right, Tom. We had it all, a family stitched together with love. 2 beautiful kids growing into their own, and finally, after all those years of hustling, time to chase the dreams we'd put on hold. Sally and Jenny were out there thriving, volunteering, diving into their passions, living these vibrant, colorful lives, while I just stagnated. I felt trapped, like I was watching the world move on without me. Her fingers traced the rim of her glass absently as she continued. A couple of years back, I started volunteering at the outreach center, hoping it'd shake me out of that rut. I met so many people there, kind souls, broken souls, everyone in between. Sally was there too, working alongside me. At some point, she got tangled up with a guy from one of the corporate sponsors, a slick, charming type who turned her head. After that, all she could talk about was how alive she felt with him. How exhilarating it was to step into something new. I didn't like it, didn't approve of the way she was throwing herself into it, and I think she sensed that. But she didn't let it stop her. One day, She decided I needed shaking up too and tried to set me up with one of his buddies. She gave a small, rueful laugh, shaking her head. That's how I met Charles. He wasn't pushy or overbearing, not at first. He was just easy to be around. We'd grab lunch or dinner whenever I could slip away, nothing serious. For a long time, it stayed light, friendly. He knew I was married, and I thought that drew a clear line between us. But lines blur, don't they? Over time, that friendship started to feel different, warmer, deeper. More significant than it should have. I knew it was dangerous, knew I was stepping onto a path I had no business walking, but I couldn't pull myself back. Her voice dropped, heavy with the memory. A few months before I left, I was at his apartment for lunch. It was supposed to be casual, like always, but something shifted that day. The air felt thick, charged. And I realized it was getting too close, too intimate. I pulled back before it went anywhere. Thank God he didn't push me. I couldn't do that to you, Tom. I couldn't cross that line. And I need you to know that, I never did, not with him, not with anyone, while we were married. Not once. She looked at me then, her eyes pleading for me to believe her, and I held her gaze. Searching for the truth in it. Charles didn't like waiting, she went on, but he accepted it, or at least he said he did. I told myself I couldn't hurt you by cheating. But somehow I convinced myself I'd fallen in love with him anyway. In the end, I lost the real love I'd always had, you, because of it. When I decided to file for divorce. I didn't tell Charles the first wasn't taking anything from our marriage. I felt too guilty, like I didn't deserve a single piece of what we'd built. He didn't know about my savings either, I kept that hidden. A secret I clutched like a lifeline. She took a shaky breath, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her wine again. That Monday evening. After my lawyer called to say you'd signed the papers, I still couldn't bring myself to start anything with Charles until the divorce was final. It felt wrong. Like stepping over a grave that wasn't even cold yet. But I was already doubting everything, terrified of turning back. Charles, he was furious when I told him I needed to wait. He yelled. His face twisting with impatience, but I talked him down, promised him it'd all come together once the ink was dry. Looking back, I see how stupid I was, how blind. Her voice cracked. And she pressed a hand to her chest as if to steady herself. When my lawyer handed me the final papers, I gave Charles what he wanted, myself, fully, no more holding back. But it felt cheap, Tom. Every nice thing about him, every gentle word or charming smile, it was all a mask. He was selfish, hollow, and I'd been too dazzled to see it. I tried to keep up appearances, especially for the kids. But they saw through me. And especially, she was devastated. I ran into her once when I was with Charles, and the look in her eyes cut me to the bone. She screamed at me, called me names I deserved. And he joined in, spitting venom right alongside her. That day was brutal, and it didn't get easier for a long time. She swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the table. About a week later, Charles stormed into the kitchen where I was making coffee. He was livid, practically shaking with rage, and he threw a newspaper down in front of me. "Why didn't you take this chance?" he demanded. Jabbing at the page. I didn't know what he meant until I picked it up and saw it, a photo of you, Tom, with another man, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years. I started reading the article. And halfway through, I laughed. Not a bitter laugh, but a real one. I was happy for you, genuinely happy, and it felt like the universe was balancing the scales, giving you the joy I'd stolen. I didn't deserve anything after what I'd done, and I told Charles that. He asked if I'd known about it, and I lied, said yes, just to shut him up. I shouldn't have. Her voice darkened. And she wrapped her arms around herself as if warding off a chill. He didn't take it well. He crossed a line after that, one I didn't think he was capable of crossing. I'd tell myself it was just rough, just a bad moment, but it wasn't. It was worse, cruel, dehumanizing, the kind of thing no one should ever have to endure. People say it can't happen if you've been with someone, if you've trusted them, but they're wrong. It hurt, Tom, in every way a person can hurt, and the worst part is I let it happen. I didn't fight back, didn't report it, even when and begged me to. I called her that night, sobbing, expecting her to hang up on me. But she didn't. She came for me, picked me up from that hell. And somehow, through all her anger, she saved me. A faint, fragile smile tugged at her lips. If there's any light in this mess, it's that it brought him back to me. She helped me find a new place. This little apartment where I've been piecing myself back together. I got a job, started over. It's not much, but it's mine. She looked at me then, her smile fading into something sadder. More uncertain. Everything I've told you, it lines up with what and said, doesn't it? I wasn't unfaithful while we were married, Tom, I swear it. I regret it all, every choice that led me here. I paid for it too, with someone who turned out to be a monster. I'm sorry, more than I can ever say. I didn't know how to respond. My mind was a tangle of emotions, anger, pity, confusion. All swirling together like a storm I couldn't navigate. Helen, I said finally, pushing up from the table, you made some terrible calls, and I don't even know where to begin unpacking it. I walked into the kitchen, the linoleum cool under my feet, and poured us 2 more drinks from the bottle on the counter. When I came back, I set them down on the old dining table, the one we'd shared for years, it scratches and stains a map of our life together, and sat across from her again. A friend told me I need to find peace with all this, I said, staring into the amber liquid in my glass. She's right. I can't move forward until I settle what's churning inside me. I'll never fully understand why you did it, Helen. But honestly, why didn't I leave first? Our marriage was a wreck long before you walked out. We let it rot, both of us. And I didn't lift a finger to stop it. I watched you drift away, and that's a guilt I'll carry too. When you left, I mourned you, for about 15 minutes. I cried until my chest hurt. And then I opened that bottle of rum from Puerto Rico, the one I'd saved for something special. I drank it dry over the weekend, and by Monday, I was making plans with Carl. Setting my own life in motion. I'd always meant to sell the business, take us somewhere new, but life laughed at that idea, and now I'm living something I never imagined. I took a sip. The burn grounding me. And asked if I thought we could ever go back to what we had. I told her no. I'm not the same Tom I was a year ago, and you're not the same Helen. We've both changed too much. She nodded, a flicker of anxiety crossing her face, but she didn't argue. Tom, she said softly, I made this mess. I regret it every day. People tell me to beg for your forgiveness. To fight to win you back, but I know you. You've got a heart bigger than most, but when you said you mourned me for 15 minutes and moved on, it hit me. I've known you for over 25 years. And I know that's you, kind, but resolute. If I could go back, I'd spend my life fixing this with you, the only man I've ever truly loved. But I see it now, you've moved forward, and I'm too late. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over as she blinked, and I felt my own vision blur. We'd lost something irreplaceable. A quarter-century of shared history crumbling under the weight of her choices and my inaction. Tom, she whispered, her voice breaking, can you hold me one last time? I didn't hesitate. I stood. Crossed the small space between us, and wrapped her in my arms. She melted against me, her frame trembling as memories flooded my mind, our wedding day under a sky streaked with pink. The births of our girls, lazy vacations by the sea, the laughter of friends and family weaving through it all. It was a tapestry of a life we'd built. And letting her go felt like tearing it apart all over again. When I finally released her, she looked up at me, eyes shimmering with a love that hadn't faded, despite everything. "Goodbye, Tom," she said, her voice a fragile thread. "You're the only man I'll ever love." She turned away, tears carving paths down her cheeks, and hurried back to her room, the door clicking shut behind her. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my heart urging me to follow, to say something, anything, to bridge the chasm between us. But reason won out. I grabbed my coat, the fabric heavy in my hands, and walked out into the night, the echo of her words trailing me like a shadow. Later, as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her story replayed in my mind, a haunting melody of love, loss, and the choices that had redefined us both. The night stretched endlessly before me as I lay in bed, the sheets tangled around my legs like a restless sea. And, my generous host had opened her home to me, and the weight of that kindness pressed against my chest. I knew I couldn't keep our earlier conversation locked away in my mind forever, she'd pry it out of me eventually. Her curiosity relentless yet gentle, like a tide wearing down a stubborn rock. There wasn't much fresh to tell her, just echoes of what she already suspected, but I felt compelled to lay it bare. "Sweetheart," I began, my voice soft in the dim glow of her guest room, "there's really no chance of us getting back together." I'd learned long ago to avoid absolutes. Life had a way of twisting even the firmest declarations, but the truth lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable. And tilted her head, her eyes searching mine with that piercing clarity only she possessed. "Dad, if you were unhappy, then no, I wouldn't want that. But you haven't really sorted it all out in your head, have you?" She was right, as always. My daughter and I shared a bond forged in years of unspoken understanding. She could see the cracks in my facade even when I tried to plaster them over. Inside, I was a mess of loose ends, a man haunted by the nagging sense that something vital remained unresolved. This trip was supposed to stitch those threads together, to grant me the peace I craved. But instead, it unraveled me further, leaving me staring at the ceiling well past midnight. By morning, the restlessness had hardened into resolve. I booked an earlier flight back to San Francisco, cutting my stay short by a couple of days. The decision settled over me like a thin blanket, not warm, but comforting enough to carry me through. As the plane hummed through the dark sky, my thoughts drifted to Carl's reports about Charles Madison, Helen's bewildering choice of a partner. The man was a storm wrapped in human skin, 3 marriages crumbled in his wake. A string of divorces punctuated by arrests for cruelty that painted him as a walking disaster. How had Helen, with her sharp mind and quiet strength, tangled herself up with someone like him? It gnawed at me, the puzzle of it. Maybe she'd been drawn to the chaos, or maybe it took a hurricane to shake her awake. Either way, she'd cut ties swiftly, and that was a small mercy I clung to. Carl had dug deeper at my request, unearthing evidence of Charles's affairs with 2 other married women. With a few discreet moves, he'd slipped that truth to their spouses and Charles's employer. The fallout was swift, both women left him, and his job vanished like smoke in the wind. Justice, I supposed, though it didn't erase the bitter taste in my mouth. The overnight flight spat me out into the San Francisco airport parking lot at 2 a.m., the world cloaked in a stillness that felt almost sacred. I grabbed a greasy burger from a late-night diner. The kind of place where the lights buzz and the air smells of stale coffee, before dragging myself home. It was nearly 5 a.m. when I unlocked the door to my condo. A 2-story corner unit with a patio that caught the morning sun just right. I paused in the entryway, letting the quiet wash over me. The nightlight glowed softly, casting long, lazy shadows across the floor, and I rolled down my window to feel the cool breeze against my skin. Even the crickets held their breath, as if the world was waiting for something to shift. Then. Movement, a door creaked open at Unit 38, and a man stepped out, tugging his hat low over his brow. He moved with the easy swagger of someone who owned the night. Sliding into a sleek gray Porsche Boxer. I knew him instantly, Art Shack, a name that flickered through my memory like a half-remembered tune. But he didn't live there, Janet did. The thought lingered. A faint itch I couldn't scratch, as I watched his taillights vanish into the dark. Sleep eluded me again, and I woke later than intended, the Thursday sun already climbing high. With a few days before I needed to return to Omega, I dialed Bill, my voice gravelly but warm. "Hey, I'm back in town early if you need me." He didn't, so I threw myself into work. The familiar rhythm a balm for my scattered thoughts. Mid-morning, I wandered to a nearby cafe, the kind with mismatched chairs and the scent of fresh bread wafting through the air. I'd barely settled with a flaky pastry and a steaming coffee when a voice broke through my haze. "Hello there." I looked up to see Dana. Her tall frame and dark hair striking against the soft light streaming through the window. We'd met weeks ago at Janet's parents' place, and her easy smile stirred something in me. "Good morning," I replied, gesturing to the empty seat. "Join me if you'd like, I'm just indulging in a little breakfast." She slid into the chair, and we fell into conversation, the hour slipping away over brunch. Dana was a breath of fresh air, confident, with smooth skin that glowed under the cafe's warm lights, and a mind that danced between topics with effortless grace. She teased me about a promise I'd made to visit her business incubator, and I found myself agreeing to stop by the next day. There was something about her that felt like a lifeline, pulling me out of the murk I'd been wading through. Later, I rang Carl, my brother and steady anchor. He'd set up bank accounts in Helen's name. A task I'd entrusted to him after wrestling with the decision. I transferred $5 million into them, a sum that might raise eyebrows but felt right in my bones. My daughter's plea to do something meaningful for her mother had tipped the scales. Anne's voice, soft yet insistent, always had a way of cutting through my doubts. Helen had been the unseen scaffolding of my success, holding up our home while I built an empire, even if I'd been too blind to notice her quiet sacrifices back then. If fate had turned another way, she could have claimed far more than this in a courtroom. I didn't care if others judged me, this was my piece to make. I didn't cross paths with Janet that day, she lived at the far end of the building. Our units blind to each other, which suited me just fine. Our relationship, if you could call it that, hovered in a gray space we'd never defined. I'd always believed adults should talk these things out, but the words never came, and now they felt unnecessary. At 1 a.m., I glanced out my window and saw that little gray car again, parked like a ghost in the lot. Irritation flared, maybe it was the years since my last real relationship, or maybe it was something uglier, a flicker of possessiveness I didn't want to name. By morning, it was gone, and I pushed it from my mind, reaching for the phone instead. "Hi, Dana. Good morning, this is Tom Davis. Are you free for lunch today? I'd love to see your office if that works." Her voice brightened the line. "Noon sounds great. I'll meet you there." We set a date. And I let my thoughts drift to an idea that had been simmering, a workspace in her building, a side project to tinker with alongside my son, Jason. He was a wizard with electronics. His hands deft with circuits and robotics, while I handled the software, the mind to his muscle. Together, we could build something extraordinary, a legacy for him and an outside my duties at Omega. When I pitched it to Dana and her partner Gail over lunch, their surprise was palpable. This was meant to be a casual visit, after all. But they warmed to it, and I secured the space at a fair price. A sandbox for creativity I couldn't wait to dive into. Jason's reaction hit me like a gust of wind. "Dad, this is a lot to process. Can I take some time to think it through?" His voice trembled with the weight of it, and I assured him there was no rush. And, meanwhile, was still jobless, having walked away from a gig tied too closely to her mother's ex-partner. She'd turned down offers I thought were golden, her choice is a mystery to me, maybe that's just how her generation moves. When I laid out the plan, her eyes sparked with excitement despite her lack of experience. Yes, she said, quick and certain, eager to tackle marketing and sales. I roped in Carl to handle the logistics, California operations, insurance, the nuts and bolts, and by Friday, the Davis family had planted the seed of something new. I took the weekend off, jetting to Las Vegas by 5 p.m. The city's neon embrace a welcome distraction. I didn't see Janet, didn't care to, and lost a chunk of cash at the tables by midnight. It didn't sting as much as it should have, I was too busy shaking off the ghost of that little car and the questions it dragged behind it. In the bustling office, Bill had a knack for surrounding himself with a team of impeccably dressed young women, each radiating confidence and poise. Their sharp blazers and polished heels clicked against the hardwood floors as they moved with purpose, exuding an air of competence that was impossible to ignore. Bill had raved to me about their credentials, degrees from top-tier schools, internships at prestigious firms, and glowing recommendation letters that painted them as nothing short of exceptional. I could see why he'd chosen them, and after brief introductions where their firm handshakes and bright smiles left an impression, we dove back into the grind of work. The day slipped away. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I dragged myself home, my mind still buzzing with spreadsheets and strategies. The next few days blurred into a relentless cycle of company demands. I'd roll into the office before the first rays of dawn streaked the sky, my coffee steaming in a travel mug, and linger long after the cleaning crew had swept through, the hum of their vacuums fading into silence. Any illusions I'd harbored about maintaining a vibrant social life evaporated like mist under the harsh glare of reality. Unless you counted the endless parade of business lunches and dinners, plates of seared salmon and glasses of overpriced wine paired with forced small talk, my evenings were a wasteland. I'd sit across from clients or colleagues, nodding at their anecdotes, while my thoughts drifted to the pile of emails waiting back at my desk. It wasn't glamorous, but it was my life now. Meanwhile, Jason and Anne, my dependable allies, took charge of liaising with Dana and Gail over at the business incubator. The four of them formed a tight-knit crew, their laughter and brainstorming sessions spilling out of glass-walled meeting rooms. To cut costs and give me some breathing room, they hatched a plan to split a 3-bedroom apartment downtown, a practical decision that suited their independent spirits. Jason, with his quick wit and laid-back charm, had spent years fending for himself, while Anne, ever the organizer, thrived on crafting her own path. Gail, a soft-spoken dreamer with a knack for sketching designs, and Dana, a fiery go-getter who could negotiate with the best of them, rounded out the group. I'd grown accustomed to my solitude, too, savoring the quiet of my own space after years of carving out a life on my own terms. It took them less than a week to settle in, their new place a whirlwind of unpacked boxes, mismatched furniture, and the faint scent of takeout lingering in the air. Friday night rolled around, and by 10 p.m., I found myself sprawled on my patio, the cool breeze rustling the leaves overhead. A glass of bourbon rested in one hand, its amber glow catching the light, while a cigar smoldered in the other, sending lazy spirals of smoke into the night. The day's tension melted away with each sip, the world shrinking to the flicker of stars and the distant hum of the city. Then the doorbell pierced the stillness, a sharp, unexpected chime that jolted me upright. I stubbed out the cigar, brushed the ash from my shirt, and padded to the door, my heart thudding with curiosity. When I swung it open, there stood Janet. Her silhouette framed by the porch light, her dark hair slightly tousled and her cheeks flushed with a telltale rosy hue. For a moment, words eluded me, my tongue tripping over itself as I processed her presence. "Hey, Janet, come on in," I managed, stepping aside with a clumsy wave. She shrugged off her jacket. The fabric rustling as I hung it on the rack, her familiar scent, a mix of jasmine and something earthy, stirring memories I couldn't quite place. It had been over a week since I'd last seen her. That fleeting glimpse of Art slipping out of her condo at dawn still gnawing at the edges of my mind. He'd done it again the previous Friday, his car vanishing into the early morning fog, leaving me to wonder what threads tied them together. "Tom, how've you been?" she asked, her voice soft but slurring just enough to betray a few drinks. She swayed slightly, her eyes glassy yet searching. "I'm hanging in there," I replied, forcing a smile. "Work's been a beast with the new gig, keeps me on my toes. Looks like you kicked off the weekend with a head start." "Huh?" I tried to chuckle, but unease coiled in my gut, tightening with every second of her unsteady gaze. "Yeah," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "My cousin Pam swung by earlier. We cracked open a bottle, or two, and caught up. And mentioned you've been swamped, so I didn't want to bug you. But it's Friday, and I figured you might be free." Her words hung awkwardly between us, a fragile bridge over an unspoken chasm. The air felt thick, so I busied myself fixing her a drink, gin and tonic, her usual, while topping off my bourbon. We drifted back to the patio, where the fire pit crackled, casting a warm glow that danced across her features. The chill of the night retreated as we sank into cushioned chairs, the flames painting shadows on the stone tiles. For a while, we sat in companionable silence, sipping our drinks and letting the quiet settle over us like a blanket. The stars glittered above, and the distant hum of traffic faded into a soothing lull. Then Janet's voice cut through the stillness, fragile and trembling. "My mom has breast cancer," she whispered, her eyes dropping to the ground as tears welled up, spilling silently down her cheeks. My heart lurched, a pang of helplessness washing over me. I set my glass down and crossed the short distance between us, kneeling beside her chair. She leaned into me, her sobs muffled against my shoulder, her body shaking with the weight of her confession. I wrapped an arm around her, feeling the dampness of her tears soak through my shirt, my mind racing. Art's shadow loomed large, those early mornings at her place. The casual way he'd lingered, and I couldn't shake the image. But her mom's illness hit closer to home, stirring memories of my own mother's battle. Of Helen's steady presence when I'd crumbled under the strain. "When did you find out?" I asked, my voice low and gentle, brushing a hand over her hair. "A week and a half ago," she murmured, pulling back to wipe her eyes. "While you were back east." "I've been with her mostly, except when I came back to see and a couple days ago." "You've been gone since last Wednesday." Her words trailed off, and I frowned, piecing it together. "Who's been looking after your condo?" She sniffled, managing a faint smile. "Pam asked Art to check on it. You met him at Mom's Christmas dinner. He's the guy who's always flirting with me, much to your chagrin." Her lips quirked, a glimmer of her usual spark breaking through the tears. The pieces clicked into place, and I decided to lay my cards on the table. "That explains why he's been there so often," I said, watching her reaction. Her brow furrowed, confusion clouding her face. "What do you mean, so often?" "He was just supposed to pop in each morning." I hesitated, then pressed on. "I saw him leave at 5 a.m. last Friday. Then roll back in at 1 a.m. Saturday. His car was gone by the time I woke up." Her eyes widened, a flicker of hurt flashing through them. "Wait, you thought he was with me while you were away?" I nodded, and she lunged forward, wrapping her arms around me, her head shaking fiercely. "Tom, I'm not perfect, but I'd never betray you like that. I get lonely sometimes. Crave that connection, and when you're here, you're the one I want to turn to." Her words sank in, warm and earnest, soothing the doubts that had festered. "Let's sit," she said, tugging me back to the chairs. "Mom's going to be okay. Surgery's next Tuesday, and the doctors are optimistic. It's small, nowhere critical. They think they can get it all. I'm just rattled about Art now. We go way back, dated before my marriage, had a fling after the divorce. It was nothing serious to me, just a distraction for him. I haven't seen him in over a year. So him staying overnight is weird. I'll talk to him." I doused the fire, the embers hissing as we headed inside. "Why don't you crash here tonight?" I offered. "We'll check your place together tomorrow." She agreed, and though she slipped into my bed, nothing crossed the line. I lay awake, listening to her soft breaths, my mind churning. I liked her, really liked her. Trust was fragile, but I wanted to believe in us, in the spark that flared when we were together. Morning light streamed through the curtains. And after coffee and a quick change, we trekked to her condo. I poked around, a nagging hunch pulling me to the master bedroom. "Janet, come here," I called, my voice tight. She stepped in. And I pointed to a tiny camera nestled among scarves on her dresser, a high-def model I'd seen at work, designed to record in dim light, angled perfectly at the bed. Her face paled as I explained its capabilities, though I couldn't pinpoint the receiver. "Who's been in here besides you?" I asked. She chewed her lip. "Mom, Pam, Art, maybe Dad when he visited." I held up a finger and darted back to my place, rummaging through my utility closet until I unearthed an RF detector, a clunky thing that'd light up if it caught a signal. Back at her condo. I swept the rooms, finding nothing. I tucked it behind her mirror, flipped it on, and checked the remote. No signal. Relief washed over me. "The lens is closed, it's off," I said. "But we don't know who put it there or when. I doubt it's your parents or Pam. That leaves Art." I hatched a plan, coaxing Janet into it despite her hesitation. That evening, she parked out front. Signaling she was home, the RF remote on her dresser in plain sight. If the blue light blinked, she'd call me discreetly. She slipped into leggings and a sweater, poured a glass of wine, and wandered her condo, her movements casual yet deliberate, a performance for an unseen audience. At 11:30, my phone buzzed. I crept around the building's corner, eyes scanning the shadows. There, in a sleek Porsche Boxer, sat Art, his face illuminated by a screen, utterly engrossed. I signaled Janet to keep going, then flagged down Detective Tate from Sonoma County Sheriff's Office, who'd agreed to meet me. He strode to the car, yanked the door open, and ordered Art out, motioning me back. Art's arrest was swift, voyeurism, trespassing, the works. I called Janet. "It's over." She emerged, now in jeans and a jacket, as Art glowered from the patrol car. Tate grilled her briefly, then turned to me with a handshake before confiscating Art's laptop. Back inside. I hoped the sheriff's crew wouldn't misread Janet's role. If they did, Marge, my secretary and Tate's wife, would set them straight. The next morning dawned golden. A weight lifted as I woke beside Janet, her presence a quiet comfort. I whipped up breakfast, sausages sizzling in the pan, their savory aroma filling the kitchen. Her mom's surgery went well. The prognosis hopeful, a fragile promise of remission. Back at the company, Jason and Anne's venture, Softtech Robotics, was gaining traction. Carl handled the legal maze. And my loan fueled their R&D. By summer, Jason had a tech whiz on board, crafting a prototype for a biotech firm in South San Francisco. It was a hit, and as we eyed scaling up, I felt a swell of pride, for them, for Janet, for the messy, beautiful life we were building. In the bustling town of San Rafael. The secured production facility hummed with activity as Omega diligently churned out programming services. I had taken a deliberate step back from the whirlwind of negotiations, not wanting to stir any tensions or muddy the waters with conflicting interests. Within a year, Softtech had roared to life, operating 6 days a week with grueling 12-hour shifts that stretched both stamina and spirit. The business flourished, a testament to the tireless efforts poured into it. And both Softtech and Omega rode the wave of prosperity together. Meanwhile, Janet and I had woven a bond that felt sacred, exclusive in its quiet intensity. I didn't entertain the thought of anyone else, and from what I could tell, her heart didn't wander either. We'd sit together sometimes, sipping drinks under the dim glow of evening, tossing around ideas about what the future might hold. But Janet, with her guarded smile and faraway look, wasn't ready to anchor herself to anything permanent. And I found myself teetering on the same uncertain edge, caught between my old-fashioned dreams and the shifting tides of reality. One afternoon, Helen rolled into San Rafael, her presence a soft echo from a life I'd once known intimately. She'd come to see the kids, now settled into their new homes, and I watched her from a distance, a mix of pride and melancholy tugging at me. Our divorce was years behind us, but the support I provided gave her the freedom to visit without the weight of financial strain pressing down on her shoulders. It warmed me to know she could be there for them, unburdened. "Tom, you still love her, don't you?" she asked, her voice gentle but piercing as she studied me with those familiar eyes. I paused, letting the question settle into the cracks of my thoughts. "Yes, Janet. I always will," I admitted, my voice steady but laced with a quiet ache. We had 20 beautiful years, 20 years of laughter, chaos, and raising 2 incredible kids. That kind of love doesn't just vanish into thin air, it shifts, reshapes itself into something softer, something different. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling as memories flickered like old film reels. Do I wish things hadn't unraveled? Of course I do. But life doesn't bend to wishes, it carves its own jagged path. My words hung there, heavy with truth, and I drifted inward, lost in the tangle of what was and what might have been. Janet rose from her seat, her movements fluid and deliberate, and crossed the room to refill her wine glass. She returned with a fresh rum and coke for me, the ice clinking softly as she handed it over. "Tom, would it bother you if I said I've been talking to Helen?" she asked, a playful chuckle slipping out as she settled back onto the couch. "Oh, never mind, it's not a big deal. We've had lunch a few times, actually. I can see how deeply she still cares for you, but she's struggling to let go. She can't even glance at another man. Did you know she still wears that ring on her left hand?" Her words painted a picture I hadn't fully grasped, and I pictured Helen, alone, tethered to a past she couldn't release. "Your daughter feels it too," Janet added. "Helen would rather be by herself than let someone new in." The image stirred a storm inside me, 2 currents clashing in my chest. One part of me shrugged, cold and detached, reasoning that Helen had carved her own solitude with the choices she'd made. But the other part ached, mourning the immense loss we'd both suffered, not just from her decisions, but from the slow drift of years that had frayed the threads between us. I thought about the people I'd met, loudmouths at the bar or coworkers over lunch, who preached about revenge, about clawing back what they felt owed through someone else's pain. They tossed those ideas around like they were nothing, but they'd never tasted the real bitterness of it. The kind that sinks into your bones and hollows you out. Revenge wasn't some grand, heroic act, it was a slow poison that ate through everyone it touched, the seeker included. I wasn't wired that way. Helen had been my world for so long, and even now, despite the sting of her actions, I couldn't erase the care I still carried for her. I glanced at Janet, sprawled comfortably across my couch, her presence a steady anchor in the room. "Janet, I'm not upset you've talked to her, I said, my tone soft but firm. If it helps her find some peace, I'm glad for it. But you need to know she shattered what was left of us. We've both changed, too much, maybe. I love the Helen I married, the one I built a life with. But the woman she turned into when she walked away? I can't love her. The words felt raw, spilling out like a confession I wasn't sure I fully believed. Janet's eyes held mine, and I wondered if she saw the flicker of doubt I couldn't hide. That night years ago, standing outside her apartment, my hand hovering near the bedroom door, I'd felt it, the pull of what lingered, warring with the wall I'd built to keep moving forward. Tom. I'm not going anywhere, Janet said, her voice warm and resolute, cutting through my spiraling thoughts. But before I tell you what's really on my mind, I want you to know I'm about to slip into something cozier. I'm going to spend some real time with you tonight. First, though, promise me something. She leaned closer, her gaze steady. Take Helen out, just for a talk, nothing more. Share a meal, catch up about the kids, whatever feels right. She needs it, and so do you. You both deserve a friendship to lean on. Something to carry you past this limbo you're stuck in. I couldn't help but laugh, the sound breaking the tension like a crack in glass. You've got this all figured out, don't you? She nodded. A sly smile curving her lips. And I worked it out together, no tricks, I swear. She was thrilled to see us together. But she also wanted her mom and dad to have a connection that wasn't tangled up in the divorce or the mess of the past. I'd hold you up while she looked after Helen. Pretty clever, huh? I just nodded, letting her words settle, and she kept her promise. She changed into something soft and inviting, and we shared a night that felt rare and unguarded. When it was over, I leaned close and murmured, yeah, it was clever, my breath brushing her ear. The next day, work swallowed me whole. Bill, my boss, had been locked in talks with a German company for months. And now the pieces were falling into place. Tom, this is a $300 million deal, he said, his excitement barely contained. It'll plant us firmly in the European and Asian markets with the new biotech software we've been perfecting. It's a hell of an opportunity. I leaned forward, the weight of it sinking in. Bill. That's massive. How do you see us handling it from here, or in Germany? He grinned, leaning back in his chair. The board and I have been hashing it out. We need a full restructure. And we want you to lead it. Just for a while. I'll step into your role here until you're back for good. Can you swing it? It was a lot to chew on, and I wanted to mull it over. But when the chairman throws a request like that your way, no, doesn't come easy. I nodded, and we hammered out the details. A whole year away. Janet, that's a long stretch, I said later. Watching her face for a reaction. Why don't you come with me? I'll be back every month or so. She turned to the window, her expression clouding as she stared out at the fading light. I can't, Tom. I need to be here for Mom. Her mother had battled breast cancer with a fierceness I admired, but now other shadows were creeping into her health. Janet had been spending more time at her side. Even toying with the idea of moving back home. Her dad was fading from the picture, leaving the vineyard they owned in the hands of a trusted manager. Okay, I said, reaching for her hand. We'll make it work, I promise. She smiled, a fragile but genuine curve of her lips. You'll keep that promise from last night, though, right? She pressed, her eyes searching mine. I knew what she meant, taking Helen out, bridging that gap. It was a strange thing, a partner nudging you toward an ex, but Janet saw the bigger picture, and I trusted her for it. Helen wasn't a mystery to me. After 25 years of marriage, I knew her, the way she laughed, the food she craved, the quiet habits that defined her. With Janet, I'd shared maybe 2,000 fleeting, precious moments, but with Helen, it was a lifetime etched deep. The thought of sitting across from her again felt risky, and Janet probably sensed that. Helen had a pull, a magnetism that hadn't dulled. I remembered a visit to her apartment a couple of years back, when she was staying with Anne. I'd stood outside her door. The salty breeze off the water tugging at my jacket, my hand frozen inches from knocking. She'd tried reaching out after I sent money her way, but I'd let her calls fade into silence. I avoided her when she was with the kids, or Jason, if I knew she'd be there. It wasn't anger that kept me away, it was the flood of what we'd lost, a tide that never seemed to ebb. For some, divorce dulls the edges over time. For me, it sharpened them. Now, here I was, standing at her door again. "Hello, Tom." "Hello, Helen." She looked radiant, fit, vibrant. Her hair catching the light just right. The soft gray dress hugged her frame, pearls gleaming at her throat, earrings I'd gifted her years ago dangling delicately. "Still a rum and coke man?" she asked with a knowing smile. I nodded, and in moments, she'd mixed one for me, pouring herself a glass of wine. We sank into the couch, the air between us thick with unspoken years. "Tom." "It's been a while," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've got so much I want to say, but I don't know where to begin." I smiled, raising a hand to ease her nerves. "No hurry. I thought we'd just catch up, talk about the kids, family stuff. And I've got reservations at Morimoto in Napa at 7:30. We've got time for a drive first." We sipped our drinks. The conversation flowing easy and light, and when she grabbed her jacket, we headed out. I'd brought the Porsche, and as I helped her into the passenger seat, her smile flashed back to simpler days. The drive was a balm, open roads, casual chatter, nothing too heavy pressing down. I shifted gears just to hear the engine purr, and her eyes lit up with every burst of speed. A spark of the girl I'd known decades ago. By the time we pulled into Morimoto, the clock was ticking close to our reservation. The restaurant welcomed us with its warm, sprawling charm, gray and yellow tones blending into a Japanese-inspired haven. Soft sofas, sturdy wooden tables, and a sleek sushi bar stretched across the space. I loved it here, and so did Helen. It was a shared favorite from years past. We settled at a quiet table, ordering drinks and appetizers, the rhythm of the evening unfolding naturally. Janet mentioned wanting to go out. I said offhandedly, and Helen's smile flickered with understanding. Soon, the talk turned to Anne. "Tom, I'm worried about her," Helen confessed, her brow creasing. "She's been," her words trailed off, but the weight lingered, a thread left dangling in the air. The air between us grew heavy as Helen's voice wavered. Her eyes catching the dim light with a glassy sheen that betrayed the storm brewing inside her. "I'm just glad she still cares about me," she murmured. Her words tumbling out like fragile leaves caught in an autumn gust. I tilted my head, my brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice soft but laced with curiosity. Unsure where this was heading. She took a shaky breath, her fingers twisting the edge of her napkin as if it could anchor her racing thoughts. "And told me she doesn't want to marry or start a family anymore. She's done with all of that, she doesn't believe in it. And I can't shake this feeling that it's because of me." She didn't say it outright, but it's there, hanging in the air between us. I can feel it. Her confession hit me like a sudden chill, sharp and unexpected. For as long as I'd known Anne, she'd been the dreamer, the one who'd sketch out her future with vivid strokes, meeting someone extraordinary. Building a life together in a cozy house with a sprawling yard where kids could tumble and play. That vision had been her North Star, guiding her through every choice, every hope. To hear it had crumbled left me reeling, my mind scrambling to make sense of it. I hesitated, the question burning on my tongue, though I already dreaded the answer. Helen. Why do you think you're the reason? My voice was barely above a whisper, cautious, as if I might shatter her if I pressed too hard. She looked away for a moment, her gaze drifting to the window where the world outside blurred into streaks of passing cars and twilight shadows. When she turned back, her eyes were raw, unguarded. Because of what happened between us, Tom. It flipped everything she thought she knew about love upside down. If two people who swore they'd always care for each other can just unravel like we did, how's she supposed to trust anyone else? She never saw it coming, none of us did. And that's why she was so furious with me at first. It broke something in her. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of her words settling into my chest like a stone. Did she tell you this? I asked, searching her face for some hint of certainty. Helen gave a small, bittersweet smile. The kind that carried years of unspoken understanding. Not in so many words. But I know her, Tom. I can hear it in the spaces between what she says, the little pauses, the way her voice catches. She let slip a few thoughts, and I pieced the rest together myself. It's like reading a book with half the pages torn out, you still know the story. Before I could respond, the waiter arrived, balancing plates of steaming food that filled the air with the rich aroma of garlic and herbs. We both let the heavy conversation drift away. Unspoken agreement passing between us to savor the moment instead. The meal was a welcome distraction, succulent bites of roasted chicken and creamy mashed potatoes that melted on the tongue, paired with glasses of crisp wine that sparkled under the restaurant's warm lights. We traded stories of brighter days, her laughter ringing out like a melody I'd almost forgotten, and for a while, it felt like the past hadn't left quite so many scars. As the plates were cleared, I mentioned my upcoming trip to Heidelberg, watching her reaction unfold in that familiar, animated way of hers. A whole year, she asked, her eyebrows shooting up, a mix of surprise and something softer, concern, maybe, flickering in her eyes. Probably, I said with a shrug, swirling the last of my wine. But I'll be back and forth a few times. It's a big project, important stuff. I can't say no. I hadn't talked much about my work with her before, and I wondered if she still pictured me lounging on the profits from selling my old business, coasting through life without a care. Her worry felt genuine, though, and it caught me off guard. Hey! It could be worse, I teased, flashing a grin. They could ship me off to Timbuktu or some far-flung nowhere. Heidelberg's a gem, work hard, play hard, right? After dinner, we decided to stretch the evening a little longer, wandering through downtown Napa under a sky streaked with the last hues of sunset. The streets buzzed with life, couples strolling hand in hand. Shop windows glowing with displays of artisanal cheeses and hand-stitched leather bags. We lingered, peering through glass panes and soaking in the charm of it all. The cool night air brushing against our skin. By the time I drove her back to Anne's place, the clock was creeping toward midnight. She paused at the door, her silhouette framed by the porch light, and turned to me with a warm, inviting smile. Tom, you can stay here tonight if you want. I raised an eyebrow, caught off guard, and she laughed, a light, playful sound. I mean, there are 3 bedrooms, and Anne's gone for the weekend. I'll behave, I promise. It's late, driving back to Sonoma now would be foolish. And Janet isn't waiting up for you tonight, is she? Her smile was disarming, her logic airtight. It was nearly midnight, and the thought of the long, winding drive home felt less appealing by the second. I'd crashed in the guest room down the hall before, so I nodded. All right, you win. She brewed me a quick cup of coffee, the rich scent filling the kitchen, and soon after, I collapsed onto the bed. Exhaustion pulled me under fast, though I vaguely recall stumbling to the bathroom in the middle of the night, muscle memory guiding me down the hall as if I were in my own home. It wasn't until I flicked on the light that I remembered I wasn't alone. Thankfully, I slipped back to bed unnoticed. Morning crept in with soft sunlight spilling through the curtains. And I blinked awake to a sight that stopped my breath. Helen was there, curled up beside me, her face serene in sleep, her chestnut hair fanning across the pillow like a halo. She must have slipped in during the night, seeking comfort or maybe just the warmth of another soul. I couldn't recall the last time I'd watched her like this. Years had passed since she'd left. Since the life we'd built had fractured. Careful not to wake her, I slid out of bed, grabbed my robe, and padded to the bathroom. After splashing water on my face and running a comb through my hair, I rummaged through Anne's kitchen, delighted to find a stash of English sausages tucked in the fridge. The sizzle of them in the pan filled the air with a smoky, savory promise. Helen emerged just as I flipped the sausages, her hair mussed but her eyes bright, though a flicker of nervousness danced in them. "I hope you're not upset with me, Tom," she said, her voice small, almost fragile. I knew what she meant, her unexpected presence in my bed. But I wasn't angry. She'd needed something last night, a quiet reassurance, and I couldn't fault her for that. If I'd been awake, maybe we'd have talked it out instead. I stepped closer, wrapping her in a gentle hug. "Helen, don't worry. I'm not mad, not even a little. Besides, you've never been one to steal the covers." I winked, and her laughter bubbled up, light and free. "Unlike you, you blanket thief," she shot back, grinning as we settled into breakfast. Later, we cleaned up the kitchen, the clatter of dishes a comforting rhythm, and decided to stretch our legs with a walk. The crisp morning air carried the scent of blooming jasmine as we wandered downtown, eventually ducking into a cozy cafe. We just settled into our seats, steam curling from our mugs, when a cheerful wave caught my eye. It was Pam, radiant and buzzing with energy. Her husband Nigel trailing behind her with a warm smile. "Join us," she insisted, gesturing to the empty chairs at their table. I introduced Helen as my former partner, never liked the cold ring of ex-wife, and Pam beamed. "This is one of our favorite spots," she said, her hand absently brushing her stomach. Helen's eyes sparked with mischief. "You're expecting, aren't you?" Pam blinked, then laughed. 2 months along. "How'd you guess?" "I didn't think it showed yet." Helen grinned. "Oh, it does. The way you keep touching your belly, the glow in your face, it's all there." The table erupted in laughter, Nigel's deep chuckle blending with Pam's delighted giggle. He leaned in, eyes glinting. "Tom, we should get a golf game going, though maybe after you're back from Germany." "Oh, did you hear? David and Marilyn Stone are headed to Mannheim next month for a couple of months before Italy. Big company shakeup, David's sealing the deal." I nodded, intrigued. Mannheim's just a hop from Heidelberg. What a small world. We parted ways with hugs and promises to reconnect. And soon Helen and I were back at Anne's. I grabbed my bag, tossing it onto the passenger seat, then turned to her. "Helen, this was amazing. I'd love to do it again, reconnecting like this." It's good." She looked away for a moment, and when she turned back, her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. She stepped close, rising on her toes to hug me tight, her whisper brushing my ear. "Tom Davis, I messed up before, but not anymore. I'll always care about you. And if there's something out there bigger than us, I hope you'll take me home someday." With that, she slipped inside, the door clicking shut behind her. I stood there, rooted, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't just nostalgia, it was real. I almost followed her, but instead, I grabbed my coat and left, knowing I'd return. The drive back to my condo was a quiet blur, the Sunday roads stretching out beneath a sky heavy with thought. I'd once pictured life slowing down after the kids grew up and I sold the business, lazy days, easy joys. Instead, here I was, divorced, in a new relationship, running a thriving company with my kids. And now off to Europe for a year-long overhaul. And Helen, my ex-wife, my old friend, still carried a flame for me, one that seemed to dim Anne's own dreams. That night, Janet and I grilled shrimp at her place, the sizzle mingling with the soft hum of our conversation. I told her about my night with Helen. And her grin stretched wide when I mentioned staying over, even if it was just the guest room. She didn't say much, but her eyes danced with knowing, and later, she pressed closer, eager to bridge the space between us. As we lay there, tangled in the quiet, I murmured, "Janet, come to Heidelberg with me. The apartment's gorgeous, historic, right in the heart of it all." She shifted, nestling against me. "No, Tom. My mom needs me. And you need this time. Figure out who you want to be now. Explore, live a little. I know what I want, I like my freedom. Waking up without a map. Marriage? I had 10 years, loved 7. I'm not sure I'd do it again. But you? 25 years, and I can see you miss it. You'd leap at the chance to commit again. Go have your adventure, I'll be here. But I'm keeping it real, a year's long, and I won't tie you down. Remember Pam's deal with her first husband? Freedom while he was away? You get me." Her words lingered, a quiet offer of space, and I felt the shift. Germany wasn't just a trip, but a crossroads. For a fleeting moment, everything I'd ever believed about my life shifted. Like sand slipping through my fingers. I turned to Janet, her presence steady and familiar, and let the words spill out with a quiet confidence. "Janet, I don't think this will be an issue. I know you're not the kind of person who'd settle for just anyone. Your freedom, your independence, they're what define you. And honestly, that's been a gift to us both." I paused, studying her face, a flicker of curiosity sparking inside me. "I wonder if you feel the same way, though. You don't have to spill every detail, I'm not asking for that. It's all good either way." Her silence hung in the air, comfortable yet heavy, as my mind wandered. California was starting to feel like home, its golden sunsets and sprawling highways wrapping around me like a second skin. But even then, I couldn't shake the ghost of another woman, her face drifting into my thoughts the night before, uninvited yet vivid, stirring a restlessness I couldn't name. 3 days later, I found myself strapped into a Lufthansa seat, the hum of the plane vibrating through me as it lifted off for Frankfurt, Germany. Omega, my new employer, had already shipped a box of my belongings ahead, sparing me the hassle of overpacking. I'd kept it light, just the essentials, but there was one indulgence I couldn't resist. Before I'd even left, Omega had fulfilled a quiet dream of mine, a sleek, brand-new S65 coupe, its 621 horsepower purring in weight, a beast ready to carry me into this next chapter. The 11-hour flight stretched endlessly, a limbo of recycled air and muted thoughts, until I finally touched down. Stepping onto German soil, I felt the weight of a new beginning settle over me. Crisp and exhilarating. I'd pictured the car waiting for me in Heidelberg, gleaming under the autumn sun, but reality had other plans. Instead, a young woman stood in the arrivals hall, holding a sign with my name, Tom Davis, scrawled across it in bold letters. Her name was Mildred Onat, and from the moment she greeted me, I sensed she'd become a fixture in my life. She carried herself with an easy grace, a subtle fragrance trailing her like a whisper, and her English flowed effortlessly, putting my stumbling German to shame. I'd dabbled with a language app before the move, but my clumsy phrases felt like pebbles next to her polished fluency. She ushered me toward a gleaming BMW, its curves catching the light. And we set off south toward Heidelberg. Mildred handled the wheel with a quiet mastery, weaving through traffic as if she'd memorized every lane. The drive melted away in minutes, and before I knew it, we pulled up to an apartment building that would soon be my sanctuary. She was out of the car in a flash, her energy buzzing as she reached the entrance before I'd even unbuckled. "Come on. Her Davis," she called, her voice bright with purpose. "Your apartment's on the second floor. Your things should have arrived this morning." I followed her up the stairs, her steps quick and sure. And as we crossed the threshold, I caught sight of a petite woman waiting inside. Her hands were clasped behind her back, and a warm, genuine smile lit her face. "This is Frau Helga Schmidt," Mildred said, gesturing toward her. "She'll handle your housekeeping and cooking. You'll need to sort out a schedule with her, but I'm betting you'll love her meals." I extended my hand. And Helga's grip was firm yet kind, her eyes crinkling with a friendliness that put me at ease instantly. Mildred led me through the apartment, her voice a steady guide as she pointed out every detail. The place was sprawling, 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths. And a massive American-style fridge that stood out like a rare treasure in Germany. It dwarfed the typical German flat, and I could already imagine myself sinking into its space. On the wall, a set of car keys dangled, glinting under the light. "Your S65 is in slot 2B, Mildred said, a hint of pride in her tone. "Pearl white, red interior, just as you wanted." I pictured it waiting below, a symbol of the freedom I was chasing. We settled at the kitchen table, Mildred, Helga, and I, and mapped out a rhythm for cleaning and meals. Helga's soft-spoken suggestions carried a quiet authority, while Mildred scribbled notes with a precision that hinted at her knack for order. As evening fell, they both slipped out, leaving me alone in the stillness. I'd left San Francisco at 11 p.m. on Wednesday, and now, at midnight Thursday in Germany, exhaustion tugged at me. Helga had left a plate of sandwiches, pastrami layered with cheese, lettuce, and tomato. Their simple flavors a comfort after the long haul. A bottle of rum, a liter of Coke, and a case of half-liter beers sat nearby. A thoughtful nod to my tastes from someone who'd clearly done their homework. I sank into the couch, savoring the quiet. Though the apartment's door alarm, a grating buzz instead of a chime, jarred me from my peace. At 7:30 a.m., it screeched again, and there was Mildred, balancing 2 steaming coffees. I'd been awake for hours, jet lag gnawing at me, but my suit was pressed, my shoes polished, and I felt every inch the sharp businessman Bill had prepped me to be. "Mr. Davis, we need to go," she said, her tone clipped with urgency. "Your first meeting's at 8, and her Honnel doesn't tolerate delays." She whisked me into her BMW, and we sped to a nondescript office building 15 minutes away. The office was a study in order, rows of neat cubicles, workers tapping away in unison. A 3rd floor of executive suites looming above. It was a stark contrast to Omega's California hub, where open spaces and casual denim ruled. Here, structure reigned. Mildred guided me to a modest office on the 3rd floor, then excused herself with a promise that her Honnel would summon me soon. At 8 a.m. sharp, my phone buzzed, and I stepped into the CEO's domain. He was a stout man in his late 50s, his desk buried under reports, and he gestured to a plush chair without looking up. I sat, but as he dismissed Mildred with a curt, "That'll be all," I felt a pang of unease. She'd become my anchor in this foreign place. "Actually, her Honnel," I said, my voice steady, "I'd like Mildred to stay. She's been exceptional, handling every detail flawlessly." A faint smile flickered on her lips, and Honnel shrugged. "If you prefer, Mr. Davis. Until we find someone else." I shook my head. "No misunderstanding here. Miss Onat is my personal assistant now. I'll sort it with HR later, but for today, she's with me. I turned to Mildred. Give me a tour of the place and introduce me to the team. Then set up a staff meeting, 1 p.m., best room available. Will I need an interpreter? She shook her head, and I grinned. Perfect. Let's go meet everyone. We swept through the building, her voice cutting through the hum as she presented me to the staff. After a quick lunch, I took the reins at the meeting. First. Call me Tom, I've been Tom since I was a kid. Second, her Honel's retired as of today, I'm stepping in for the next few months. Third. Mildred's my executive assistant, she'll oversee all non-capital approvals. And finally, let's streamline things, no delays on small stuff. Now, snacks and drinks are coming. Let's loosen up and talk. The room buzzed as trays of food arrived, and I watched the team unwind, Hans from HR downing beers, Ingrid from tech laughing over wine. Mildred stayed close, her quiet support a lifeline. Later. She drove me home, helping me up the stairs though I could have managed. At 35, unmarried, she had no one waiting for her, and I sensed she cherished the connection. Helga had cooked sauerbraten. Its rich aroma filling the apartment, and I insisted they both join me. We ate, drank, and laughed late into the night, the jet lag fading into warmth. By morning, I had their numbers. Promises of more nights like this, and a cigar in hand as I basked in the glow of it all. Janet didn't cross my mind until weeks later, 2 weeks into this new life. I wondered if she'd moved on too. Oddly, I felt no guilt, no jealousy, just a strange calm. 6 weeks passed before I returned to the States, unannounced. I knocked on Anne's door, and Helen answered, her face paling. Oh my God. Oh no, she stammered. Hey, Helen, nice to see you too, I said, stepping inside. A man sat on the couch, unremarkable, just there with Helen while Anne was out. It shouldn't have mattered. But a dull ache flared in my chest. Sorry, Helen, didn't mean to barge in. Tell Anne I'll call her later. A small voice, hers, pleaded, Tom, you don't have to go, but I waved it off. It's best. 5 minutes down the road, I pulled over, wrestling with the sting. They'd done nothing wrong. I should have just said I was Anne's dad and left it there. My phone sat heavy in my hand. Unanswered questions swirling in the silence. The phone trembled slightly in my hand as I dialed Anne's home number, the familiar digits a lifeline to clarity after days of swirling doubt. It rang once, twice, and then her voice broke through, and, bright and steady, answering with a warmth that instantly softened the edges of my unease. Oh, Tom, I'm so glad you called, she said. Her tone carrying a flicker of relief, as if she'd been holding her breath for this moment. I could picture her standing in her cozy living room, sunlight spilling through the curtains. Her dark hair pulled back in that casual way she always wore it. Helen, I'm sorry, I began, the words tumbling out heavier than I'd meant them to. I shouldn't have stormed off like that. I didn't even give you a chance to explain, I just reacted. It was stupid of me. My chest tightened as I spoke, embarrassment mingling with regret. I'd let my imagination run wild. Conjuring betrayal where there was none, and now the sting of that mistake burned deep. Are you coming back? And asked, her voice soft but edged with hope. Like a kid peering through a window on a rainy day. She paused, then added, Helen, you've got someone over, and you're always such a gracious host. I didn't want to barge in and ruin your time together. Maybe we can catch up later? Her words hung there, gentle and considerate, but I could sense the unspoken worry beneath them. She'd always been the peacemaker, the one smoothing over life's rough patches with a quiet grace. Tom, it's not what you think, I said quickly. Eager to douse the misunderstanding before it flared up again. Listen, the guy here, he's a real estate agent. He's showing me some properties. And asked me to think about moving out her way. And I'm just exploring options. The admission felt clumsy, exposing a sliver of vulnerability I hadn't planned to share. I jumped to conclusions about her, and now I was the fool. Standing corrected in the dim light of my own misjudgment. Come back, then, and urged, her voice brightening like a bulb flicking on. Let's grab lunch. I'm starving. And we're wrapping up here anyway. Helen, I'm sorry I assumed the worst, I should have known better. I'll head over soon. Her eagerness washed over me, a balm to my rattled nerves. And I felt the knot in my stomach loosen just a bit. I waited as the real estate agent, a wiry man in a crisp suit, all business and clipped sentences, gathered his brochures and left. His polished shoes clicking against Anne's hardwood floor. 15 minutes later, I was back at her place, stepping into the familiar glow of her foyer. Anne greeted me with a hug that felt like coming home, her arms wrapping around me with a warmth that erased the morning's tension. She leaned in close, her breath brushing my ear as she murmured. Tom, did you really think I'd be with him? Her tone was teasing, but her eyes searched mine, seeking reassurance beneath the playful jab. Helen, it's not crazy to wonder, I admitted. A sheepish grin tugging at my lips. But no, I know better now. That's not happening, not with him, not with anyone else. I promise. The words felt solid. A vow carved from the raw honesty of the moment. We stood there, letting the silence settle between us, a quiet understanding knitting us closer. Then I broke it, clapping my hands together. Lunch sounds perfect. How about that cafe, the one where I first brought Pam and Nigel to meet you? Anne's face lit up, her hazel eyes sparking with memory, and she nodded. We drove over. The car humming along the sun-dappled streets, and slid into a booth by the window. The cafe buzzed with lunchtime chatter, the clink of cups and the rich scent of coffee filling the air. We talked about the kids, Jason's latest engineering project, Anne's marketing internship, and the little shifts in her world since I'd last seen her. I thought about mentioning Tammy and Sarah. The two English women who'd breezed through my life like a fleeting storm, but it didn't feel right. Not here, not now. Those stories could wait. Back at my apartment. We poured ourselves drinks, whiskey for me, a glass of white wine for Anne, and sank into the couch, the afternoon light slanting across the room. We made plans for dinner the next Friday. A quiet promise of more time together, and I felt a flicker of contentment settle in. Later that night, I found myself with Janet, her presence a striking contrast to the day's earlier softness. She'd dressed up, her auburn hair swept into loose waves, a deep green dress hugging her frame, and though I didn't ask why she'd taken the extra care, I couldn't help but savor it. Janet was magnetic. Her laugh a low, rich sound that filled the room as we sat close, sharing stories. I'd mentioned Tammy before, but with Janet beside me, the comparison felt stark. Tammy had been a whirlwind. Chaotic and fleeting, while Janet was steady, a partner who matched me in ways Helen once had, maybe even surpassed her, though I'd never voiced that aloud. We leaned into each other. Her shoulder brushing mine, and she gave me a playful nudge. I've got something to tell you, she said, her eyes glinting with mischief. You don't have to, I replied, waving a hand. But she shook her head, insistent. No, I want to. Maybe I even like sharing it with you. She grinned, leaning closer. A couple weeks ago, I indulged a little. Went to Napa with an old friend of Pam's. Just a fun distraction, nothing serious. I couldn't hold back a laugh, picturing her sipping wine in some vineyard, carefree and bold. Fair's fair, I said. And offered my own tale, those two English ladies, Tammy and Sarah, a brief detour I'd taken without diving into the gritty details. Janet's curiosity piqued, her head tilting as she pressed for more. But I kept it vague, a gentleman's discretion cloaking the memory. We ended up tangled together that night, the closeness a quiet thrill, her warmth seeping into me as the hours slipped away. Morning came, and over coffee, I mentioned my dinner plans with Anne. Janet's expression shifted, nothing dramatic, just a subtle stillness in her gaze. "Tom," she said, setting her mug down. "That woman cares about you, deeply. If she ever tried to win you back, I wonder how she'd feel about us, about this." Her voice was calm, but there was a question buried in it. One she didn't fully ask. I leaned back, tracing the rim of my cup. "Janet, until those English girls, I'd been faithful my whole life. You're the only one besides Helen since we married. I've never needed more than one woman, one's always been enough." Did I enjoy that fling? Sure. But it wasn't real, not like this. We were miles apart, doing our own thing, special arrangements. As your cousin Pam called it. She nodded, remembering Pam's wild stories about her first husband, Bob, and their unconventional setup. "I don't feel guilty," she said, her tone firm. "I don't regret it. But if Tammy and Sarah were free tonight, I wouldn't touch them. I'm here with you, that's what matters." "You're dodging my question," I pointed out, smirking, and she sighed, conceding the point. "All right, here's the thing," she said, her voice softening. "I talk to Anne a lot. We're friends now. Believe it or not. She knows about us, knows I'm not looking to marry you, we've been clear about that. But she's got her heart set on someone, and that someone's you. She told me there's no competition between us, that we've got something good whether she's in the picture or not. So if I asked, would you?" Her words lingered, an invitation wrapped in caution. And I felt the weight of it settle over me. I didn't answer right away. Did I want Anne back? That flash of jealousy when I'd seen the real estate agent had rattled me. But was it enough to pull me into her orbit again? And what would that mean for Janet, for us? I suspected a quiet conspiracy, and Janet, even Helen's sister, plotting to nudge me toward one of them. A trio of women weaving a web I hadn't quite untangled. Friday rolled around, and I pulled up to Anne's place, the evening air crisp against my skin. She stepped out. Radiant in a dress I recognized, deep blue, elegant, one I'd seen Janet wear too, their similar builds making the connection click. Anne's sister was there, beaming like she'd won a prize. Chattering about their shopping spree. Something was brewing, and it set my nerves jangling. We opted for a cozy Italian spot in San Rafael, skipping the longer drive I'd half-planned. The restaurant glowed with candlelight, the murmur of voices blending with the clink of wine glasses. Conversation flowed, old stories, easy laughs, but Janet's name hovered in my mind, unspoken. Tugging at my focus. After dinner, we strolled to a jazz bar nearby, settling into a shadowed corner. And looked stunning, the soft light catching the sheen of her dress. Every sway drawing my eye despite myself. We wandered afterward, pausing at a crystal shop, its windows aglow with delicate trinkets. A set of glass deer by a pond caught my gaze, eerily like one we'd owned, one Helen had left behind. "You can have it back," I said, turning to her. "I've still got it at my place." Her eyes shimmered. A tear slipping free as she looked away, then back. "Can we get it now? Tonight?" Her voice trembled, eager and fragile. I nodded, the word yes slipping out before I clocked the promise it carried. It was too late for her to drive back to San Rafael from Sonoma, she'd stay with me. The drive was smooth, my car hugging the curves as Anne sat lost in her thoughts, a faint smile playing on her lips. Inside, I flicked on the gas fireplace, dimmed the lights, and froze. There, on the counter, sat a chilled bottle of wine and 2 glasses, unplaced by me. Janet's handiwork, I'd bet. We sipped in silence, the tension thickening until and stood, her voice low and certain. "Tom, I can't wait anymore. You've brought me home, now take me to the bedroom." With a fluid motion, she shed her dress, standing there in lavender lingerie and navy heels, pearls glinting at her throat. She grabbed the wine and bottle, sauntering toward my room with a glance that dared me to follow. Desire surged, raw and deep, but I held it in check, choosing instead a gentler path. We shared a night of quiet intimacy, not rushed but profound, falling asleep as the fire's glow faded. Morning light poured in, and the scent of bacon drifted from the kitchen. And stood at the stove, humming, her hair tousled from sleep. "Good morning, Tom," she said, plating up a simple breakfast from whatever she'd found in my fridge. We ate together, the silence comfortable until she spoke. "Last night, that was the kindest thing anyone's done for me in years. When I said you're the only man I'll ever love, I meant it. There's no one else, never will be." She paused, then added, "Janet set this up, you know. She's good for you. And she's fine with this, with us doing it again sometime. But I want it too." I chewed on that, fork hovering. Janet was a rock, a spark I didn't want to lose unless we both chose it. With Anne, it was heavier, a pull I couldn't quite name. "Helen," I said finally, "let's take this slow, okay? We've got time to figure it out." She nodded, and for now, that was enough. The air still carried the faint musk of last night's intimacy as I lay there, replaying every stolen glance and fleeting touch. I didn't regret a single second of it, how could I? The joy had coursed through me as fiercely as it had through her, a shared current that left us both breathless. "Will we do this again?" she'd murmured. Her voice a soft tease against the dim glow of the bedside lamp. I'd grinned, letting the question hang between us like smoke. "I think we might," I replied, my tone light but deliberate. "But let's not tie ourselves down with promises. Let's just savor what we've had, relish every laugh, every brush of skin, and see where the wind takes us. In a couple of days, I'd be boarding a plane back to Germany, and she'd be unpacking boxes in her new place. Life was pulling us in different directions, a chaotic swirl of unknowns. And neither of us could predict what lay beyond the horizon." Helen's eyes caught mine across the room, shimmering with a cocktail of unease and quiet relief. She'd braced herself for rejection. Maybe even a cold retreat, but I didn't push her away, or pull her back into the wreckage of what we'd once been. Instead, we stumbled into something gentler, a mutual truce. A fragile bridge built on understanding. It was exactly what we both craved after the storm of our unraveling. Together, we tidied up the remnants of the evening, plates smeared with sauce, glasses kissed with wine stains. I took extra care wrapping her crystal figurine set, each delicate piece nestled in tissue like a memory I wasn't ready to let shatter. The drive to Anne's place was quiet, the hum of the engine filling the spaces where words didn't dare tread. Before I pulled away, I wrapped her in a hug, her warmth seeping into me one last time. "I'll always cherish you, Tom Davis," she whispered, her breath catching on the edge of tears. I nodded, unable to speak, and drove off into the night. Back at Janet's, the air shifted, electric. Almost frantic. She greeted me with a hunger that outstripped even her usual fire, her hands tugging at me like I'd been gone for months instead of hours. Maybe it was knowing I'd spent the previous night with Helen, maybe that sparked something possessive in her. By morning, she was still buzzing. Her laughter spilling over coffee cups as she bounced around the kitchen. "I'm thinking about coming to Germany," she blurted, her eyes wide with mischief. "Would you mind?" My heart leapt at the thought. Janet was a spark I couldn't dim, and I'd take her company over anyone else's. "Not right away," I teased, "but maybe in a couple weeks." "Think you can hold out that long?" Her mock pout dissolved into a giggle. And when I mentioned Mildred, my sharp-witted colleague with a smile that could melt steel, she lobbed a pair of couch pillows my way. I dodged, laughing, but Mildred lingered in my thoughts, steady. Kind, a quiet force I couldn't help but admire. The next day, I rang Jason and Anne, my voice steady as I laid out the latest on Soft's meteoric rise. 3 months of surging orders had turned our little venture into a juggernaut, and I wanted them in the loop. We set a meeting for that afternoon at Omega's sleek headquarters. And they strolled in right on time, Jason with his easy grin, and with her sharp, curious gaze. We settled into a conference room, the table strewn with charts and coffee mugs. The air thick with possibility. Soft had been chugging along for over 2 years, a shared dream split evenly among us 3. Our rules were ironclad, any talk of selling needed 2/3 approval. On paper, the company clocked in at $3 million, a hefty sum for its age, but I saw more. This is big money, no question, I told them, leaning forward, my hands clasped tight. But you've got a goldmine here, a product line that's killing it and a roadmap to the stars. Sell if you want, I'll back you, but I'd love to see you stick around, keep building. You're damn good at this, and success isn't a fluke with your talent. They mulled it over, exchanging glances heavy with thought. Jason scratched his chin, the gears turning behind his hazel eyes. And tapped her pen, a nervous tick betraying her excitement. Finally, they nodded, and I exhaled a breath I hadn't known I was holding. Beyond the numbers. I wanted them to bloom into the kind of leaders who'd outlast any paycheck, patient, savvy, unshakable. The market was teeming with sharks who'd snap up a gem like Soft. And I knew waiting could tip the scales even higher. 2 days later, I was wheels up to Germany, the familiar churn of jet engines a soothing hum. A gleaming white S65 waited in the parking garage. Its curves catching the light like a promise. Heidelberg called to me again, its cobbled streets and ancient spires as enchanting as ever. Helga greeted me at the apartment. Her graying curls framing a face lit with warmth. She'd outdone herself, Wiener Schnitzel crisped to perfection, fries dripping with gravy, and a chilled case of Weiss beer sweating on the counter. I sank into her hospitality, grateful for the comfort. Mildred buzzed up shortly after, her knock sharp and cheerful, and the 3 of us dug in, the clink of forks and easy chatter filling the room. Mildred had become a confidant, her dry humor and steady presence a balm after long days. She'd heard whispers of my escapades from the local crowd, tales swapped over pints at the corner pub, and it loosened her up, made her feel like part of the chaos. I never pried into her world. But her poise and quiet beauty made it hard to believe she was alone. Weeks blurred by, and a routine took root. Mildred, Ingrid, and I became a lunch trio, trading boardrooms for bistros. We'd linger over crisp salads and glasses of Riesling, the sun slanting through cafe windows, our laughter a soft rebellion against the grind. One Friday, work dragged late. And we spilled into a tavern beneath Mildred's apartment. The plan was a quick drink, but shots of tequila, rare in Germany outside rowdy student haunts, changed the game. Mildred had picked up a taste for it in college, Ingrid during sun-soaked trips to Cancun. I wasn't a heavyweight drinker, but the buzz hit fast. And Ingrid's playful nudge against my shoulder stirred memories of wilder undergrad nights. She shed her polished edges with each shot, her grin turning devilish. Mildred just smirked. Wise to the shift. I ordered another round, caught up in the reckless joy of it all, the night dissolving into a haze of clinking glasses and slurred toasts. Morning cracked open with a jolt, I was tangled in someone else's sheets, a woman sprawled across my chest, another draped over my head. Panic flickered, then faded as I clocked the room. Mildred's place, all soft grays and warm wood. Ingrid stirred, her hazel eyes glinting with mischief. "Good day, Tom," she purred, her accent wrapping around the words like silk. That was a lovely night. I managed a dazed smile, still reeling from her touch moments before. Mildred blinked awake, jolting upright as she realized how close we'd landed. "Oh my gosh," she gasped. Spinning away, her cheeks flaming. "I can't believe I did that." Laughter rumbled out of me. "Oh, you absolutely can. We'll sort it out later, right now, I'm starving." We disentangled. A clumsy dance of limbs and sheepish grins, and I stood there, marveling at the two women who'd just rewritten my morning. In the shower, Mildred slipped in behind me, her voice small. "Tom. I'm sorry, I didn't mean for this to happen." I turned, brushing a hand over her damp hair. "We're grown-ups, Mildred. No harm done." She relaxed under my touch as I scrubbed her back, the steam blurring the edges of our awkwardness. Ingrid showered next, and soon we huddled in the kitchen, piecing together the night over coffee. "I don't recall it all," I admitted. "But I know we connected." They swapped a look and burst out laughing. "Oh, yes," they chimed in unison. "Work stays out of this, right?" I pressed. "Could get messy." Ingrid waved it off. "Tom. Relax, we're discreet. Europe's different, office flings happen. Besides, our friends saw us haul you upstairs. You'll be a legend." Mildred winked, and we sealed the pact over breakfast. True to their word, the office stayed blissfully ignorant, or silent. Only Margaret, the receptionist with a knack for gossip, flashed a knowing smirk one morning when the tavern came up in passing. 3 weeks later, Janet's voice crackled through the phone at 3 a.m. "Hey, how are you?" she chirped. I rubbed sleep from my eyes, grinning. "Great, just wrapped a golf round. Do you know what time it is?" She laughed. 9 a.m. there, right? "No, I'm 9 hours ahead, 3 a.m. She cackled harder, undeterred, and told me she'd land in Frankfurt in 2 days. I asked for her flight details, but a work meeting loomed, so I tapped Mildred to grab her. Mildred knew the deal with Janet, teased me about my European arrangement, and after one soul-bearing night a week prior, we'd deepened our bond. Janet's call stirred a flicker of nerves, but Mildred insisted on discretion, and I trusted her to keep it tight. She headed out at 3 p.m. to fetch Janet while I slogged through endless client talks. We finally broke, rescheduling for dinner, and Ingrid booked us a spot at 6. I dialed Mildred to check in. The line buzzing as the day tilted toward night, my new life unfolding in vivid, unpredictable strokes. As she stepped off the plane and onto the bustling tarmac, Ingrid's voice crackled through the phone, steady and reassuring. She'd only just arrived at the airport, breathless from the journey. But already her words carried a quiet calm that brushed away my lingering unease. "Don't worry about a thing," she said, her tone bright with confidence. "I'll keep Janet company. Make sure she doesn't get into too much trouble." I could almost see the playful glint in her eye, the way she'd tilt her head when she was up to something. It was a small comfort, knowing Janet wouldn't be alone, and I let it settle over me as I turned my attention back to the evening ahead. Dinner that night was a whirlwind of clinking glasses and murmured negotiations. The kind that left you buzzing with adrenaline. I just sealed a deal, nothing monumental, but enough to make the night feel like a win. The restaurant hummed with quiet sophistication. All dim lights and polished wood, and as the meal wound down, it was time to call it a night. I offered her a ride home, my colleague from the meeting, and she accepted with a tired smile. The drive was easy, the city lights streaking past in a blur of gold and shadow, and when we pulled up to her place, she paused at the door. "Come in for a drink," she said. Her voice soft but insistent, a hint of something more lingering beneath it. For a moment, I let myself imagine it, her laughter spilling into the room, the clink of glasses. The way the night could unravel into something reckless and warm. But exhaustion tugged at me, and I knew I wasn't in the mood for where that might lead. Not tonight, I said, offering a sheepish grin. I've got company rolling in soon. She nodded, understanding flickering in her eyes, and I left it at that. The unspoken possibility hanging in the cool night air as I drove away. When I got home, the apartment was quiet, the kind of stillness that amplifies every creak of the floorboards. I parked the car in the garage, the engine ticking as it cooled, and trudged upstairs, my mind still half caught in the day's whirlwind. A note waited for me on the kitchen counter. Scrawled in Janet's familiar loops, "We're down at the tavern, come join us whenever you're back, no matter how late." I smiled at the thought of them already diving into the night. Then dragged myself to the bathroom. The shower was a quick reset, steam curling around me as I scrubbed away the day's grit, and I swapped my suit for jeans and a sweater, soft, worn in. The kind of clothes that feel like a sigh of relief. A fast shave in front of the foggy mirror, and I was out the door, the faint hum of anticipation buzzing in my chest. The tavern was alive when I got there, a riot of noise spilling out into the street even before I pushed through the door. The university exams had just wrapped, and the air crackled with that wild, unshackled energy of students finally free. Laughter bounced off the walls, glasses clinked in a chaotic symphony, and the place was packed, bodies pressed close, voices overlapping in a joyful din. It felt like walking into a festival mid-swing, all bright eyes and flushed cheeks, and I couldn't help but grin as I wove through the crowd. I didn't spot Mildred or Janet right away. So I claimed a perch at the bar near the entrance, a perfect vantage point to scan the room. The younger crowd was in full swing, spilling drinks and trading stories, their exuberance infectious. I nursed a beer, letting the chaos wash over me, until my gaze landed on them across the room. They were tucked into a long booth. The kind that could squeeze a dozen people if they didn't mind rubbing elbows. Mildred sat in the middle, framed by two young guys who looked barely old enough to be there. Their faces lit with easy grins. Janet was on her left, flanked by her own pair of admirers, while Helen, quiet, reserved Helen, was caught between two more, her usual composure fraying at the edges. The sight stopped me cold. They were all deep in it, arms slung casually around each other, shots lined up on the table like little amber dares. Helen, of all people, was tossing one back. Her movements loose and unguarded in a way I'd rarely seen. She wasn't a drinker, not like this. Back in the day, she'd sip wine or nurse a beer, maybe indulge in a mixed drink if the mood struck. But hard liquor? That was new territory. And yet there she was, cheeks flushed, finishing off a shot with a wince that melted into a laugh. The guys around them were bold, leaning in close. Their hands brushing shoulders and sides. One had his palm resting on Janet's waist, his fingers splayed across her shirt in a way that felt too familiar, too casual. Janet didn't seem to mind, she was basking in it, her head tilted back in laughter, her eyes bright with the thrill of the moment. Helen, though, looked hazier, her tipsiness softening her edges. The guys on either side of her pressed in, their arms draped over her shoulders, and I wondered if she even noticed how close they'd gotten. She swayed slightly, caught up in the rhythm of the night. And I decided to hang back, watching from my spot at the bar to see how it played out. Then one of them leaned in, a lanky kid with a mop of dark hair, and murmured something in Helen's ear. Her eyes widened, a flicker of surprise cutting through the fog, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she turned to me, catching my gaze across the room, and her lips curved into a tipsy, amused smile. "Tom, it looks like you've had quite the evening," she called out, her voice carrying a playful lilt. I chuckled, leaning against the bar as I took in the scene. "Yeah, just a typical night out." "I guess," I shot back, keeping it light even as my mind spun through the night's odd turns. We shared a laugh, soft and easy. The kind that feels like a tether between old friends amidst the fading roar of the crowd. Janet stumbled back over then, her energy dimmed but still flickering, a sleepy grin tugging at her lips. "I can't believe I got tipsy so fast," she said, flopping onto a stool beside me. Mildred smirked, sliding in next to her. "Just part of the fun," she teased, her voice warm with mischief. "You never know what's going to happen when you're out like this." The three of us fell into swapping stories, the tavern's clamor fading into a backdrop of light-hearted chatter. I felt it then, a deep, steady warmth, the kind that comes from nights like these, stitched together with laughter and the unspoken promise of looking out for each other. As the hours stretched on, Janet excused herself to the spare room, her steps unsteady from the evening's excesses. Mildred shifted closer, her voice dropping to a softer register. "You handled this really well, Tom," she said, her eyes meeting mine with quiet sincerity. "It's nice to have someone keeping an eye on us all." I nodded, her words sinking in. "Thanks, Mildred. We've got to look out for each other, right?" The night slowed after that, settling into a gentler rhythm. We traded memories, funny ones, silly ones. The kind that make your chest ache with fondness, and I felt the room fill with something intangible but real, a reminder of how much joy can hide in these fleeting, messy moments. "Tom, you didn't mention you had two ladies crashing here," Mildred said later, a playful edge to her tone as she glanced toward my bedroom. "I didn't know they'd both show up," I admitted, rubbing the back of my neck. "But it's fine for tonight, they're not really here yet, are they?" She laughed, then stood, taking my hand with a grin that felt like an invitation. She lingered at the doorway, tossing me a teasing look before slipping inside, leaving the door cracked just enough to make me pause for a heartbeat. I weighed my options: head back to the spare room where my ex-wife's snores would greet me, or follow my friend into the unknown. Curiosity won out, and I stepped inside. When I woke at 6 a.m., the bed was empty, Mildred already gone. The apartment was silent again, sunlight creeping through the blinds in pale streaks. I dragged myself through the morning routine: coffee, a quick bite, then left a note for Janet and Helen on the kitchen table: "Out for work. Maps and spare key are yours. Enjoy the day." It still threw me, seeing Helen here with Janet. Her presence a curveball I hadn't seen coming. A heads-up would have been nice, but knowing Mildred, this was probably her idea of a surprise twist. I smirked. Remembering Helen with those shots, back when we were younger, she'd have shied away from anything stronger than a spritzer. Sober Helen would have swatted those boys away without a second thought. Now, it was almost funny, picturing her caught up in the chaos. Mildred had filled me in later. Apparently, she'd roped Hans and Dietrich, the tavern's burly bartender, into keeping watch. She'd kicked off the shots herself, egged on by the guys who'd zeroed in on Janet and Helen, betting on some harmless fun with two American women who couldn't hold their liquor. It had worked. Better than she'd expected. I left my guests with maps and a key, trusting them to navigate the city while I headed out to tackle my own day. Mildred showed up at the office later, all business. Her playful spark from the night before tucked neatly away. These Germans, they had a way of flipping the switch, even Ingrid, who could match Mildred's mischief when she wanted to. Work kept me busy until the afternoon, when David Stone called. His voice boomed through the line, warm and familiar. He'd landed in Mannheim a few days back with his crew and was itching to get us out to a weekend retreat near Hirschbach, a sleepy little town not far from Heidelberg. The kind of place Mildred used to ramble about from her childhood. I jumped at it, promising to bring 3 guests along, and hung up with a grin. That evening, I came home to find Helga bustling in the kitchen, the air thick with the smell of roasted herbs and fresh bread. She'd set the table for 4, her movements precise but warm, and I waved her over. "Join us," I said, brushing off the old European habit of keeping hired help at arm's length. She hesitated, her dark eyes flickering with uncertainty, but a glass of wine later. She was laughing with the rest of us. "Janet, Helen, you two look a lot more alive than last night," I said, leaning back in my chair. Janet grinned, swirling her glass. "Thanks, Tom. I barely remember anything, so if I missed something wild, you'll have to tell me." Helen just ducked her head, a shy smile tugging at her lips. "I don't even know how I got here," she murmured. "And maybe that's for the best." I chuckled. "Probably." Helga watched it all with a quiet smile, her usual reserve melting into the evening's glow. Later, I learned she'd found them that morning, Janet sprawled across the spare bed, Helen curled up in a tangle of blankets, both looking like they'd been hit by a freight train. They'd stumbled out around 10, bleary-eyed and disheveled, only to catch sight of each other and dissolve into giggles. I wasn't sure where they'd wandered after that. But they were back by the time I got home. After Helga left, the three of us sank into the living room, the night softening around us. "So," I said, glancing between them, "how'd you two end up traveling together?" Janet didn't miss a beat. "Tom, I didn't want to go solo, and Helen didn't have plans, so I dragged her along for the ride. Europe's better with company. Right? Plus, your place has room to spare, no trouble at all." Helen sat quietly, legs crossed, sipping her wine with that faint smile I knew so well. I wasn't about to argue, it was true. I didn't mind. I just hoped it wouldn't get weird with my ex-wife in the mix. The doorbell buzzed, cutting through the moment, and Janet sprang up. "That's Mildred, we're heading out. Don't wait up." She flashed a grin, and Mildred appeared in the doorway, her smile wider and warmer than it had been in a while. "Hold up," I called as they turned to go. "We're all off this weekend after work, Mildred too. David Stone invited us to a retreat in Hirschbach. So, you know, pace yourselves this time." They laughed, a shared spark lighting their eyes. And disappeared into the night. That left Helen and me, the room suddenly quieter. She slid over, settling beside me, her voice low. "Tom, I hope you're not mad I tagged along. Janet really wanted me to come, but I could have said no." I shook my head, meeting her gaze. "Not mad, just surprised. How are the kids?" We slipped into easy talk, catching up on family. The years between us softening into something familiar. After a while, I stood. "Let's walk. Heidelberg's too pretty to miss at night." She agreed. And we stepped out into the old city, its cobblestone streets glowing under lamplight, the castle looming above, a jagged ruin against the sky. It had taken a beating in the war. But what was left still held a rugged charm. We wandered, the cool air brushing our faces, then ducked into a cozy cafe, all warm wood and soft chatter. "Helen," I said over our drinks. "This is what I always pictured for us after the kids grew up, wandering Europe, soaking it in, living free." She laughed, light and a little sad. "I know, Tom. I messed that up, didn't I?" I shrugged. Smiling. "I had my share of screw-ups too. No point dwelling on it, I don't hold anything against you. We had good times." She nodded, and for a moment, we just sat there. The past settling around us like dust in sunlight, quiet and peaceful. Lately, my bond with Helen had blossomed into something unexpectedly warm and friendly. Despite the rocky patches we'd weathered over the years. As I stole a glance at her, standing there with that familiar grace, a flood of nostalgia washed over me. She'd been my closest companion since we were kids, her presence woven into the fabric of my earliest memories. Looking at her now, I felt a bittersweet pang, regret for the missteps we'd taken. Tempered by a quiet understanding of how time had shaped us. Yet, beneath that calm surface, a restless uncertainty churned. Where did we go from here? How could I bridge the past and whatever lay ahead? Just the night before, I'd spent hours with Mildred, her laughter still echoing faintly in my mind. Her company had been a welcome escape. A spark of something lively and free. And soon, maybe tonight, certainly by the weekend, Janet would be close again, her magnetic energy pulling me in as it always did. But as I stood there, caught between these fleeting connections, a nagging truth gnawed at me: this wasn't who I was at my core. I'd laid it all bare with Janet once, confessing how much I craved the steadiness of commitment. Helen knew it too. She'd seen me at my most unguarded, back when promises meant everything. Being single, though, offered a kind of freedom I couldn't deny. No ties, no expectations, especially with Janet, who understood the rhythm of our long, unspoken breaks. Mildred had slipped into my life because of that understanding, a bright distraction I'd be dishonest to say I didn't relish. Truthfully, if my world were different, less tangled, less burdened, I could imagine myself falling for her. She had a charm that hooked me, a pull I couldn't quite shake. Then there was Ingrid, a fleeting whirl I barely recalled. Her skillful allure a hazy memory. A few others had danced through my life too, brief sparks that fizzled out before they could mean anything. They were footnotes, insignificant against the vivid chapters written with Helen, Janet, and Mildred. Helen, to me, was timeless beauty incarnate, steady, radiant, the benchmark I couldn't unseat. Janet was a wildfire, thrilling and unpredictable, while Mildred wove a spell of charm that captivated me in quieter, subtler ways. And me? I was a man pushing 50, a successful businessman in robust health. Yet dodging the hard decisions life kept tossing my way. When I couldn't avoid choosing, I floundered, adrift in my own indecision. For now, I turned to Helen, my former wife. The one constant I could still reach for. "Helen," I said softly, my voice catching with a mix of weariness and hope, "let's head home." She slipped her arm through mine. A gesture so familiar it ached, and we strolled back to the apartment under the dim glow of streetlights. The air was crisp, carrying the faint hum of the city winding down. As we passed the T, I asked her to pause. "Just a sec," I murmured, stepping inside to settle a quick matter with Dietrich. I slipped him €100, the bills crinkling in my hand, and caught sight of Mildred and Janet in the corner. They were deep in animated chatter with a lively German couple and 3 men whose faces I didn't recognize. Mildred didn't notice me. But as I turned to leave, her eyes flicked my way, and she flashed that playful wink, her signature move, a spark of mischief that always left me grinning despite myself. That night, Helen and I shared a bed, but there was no rush of intimacy, no electric charge. Instead, we lay side by side, our voices weaving softly through the darkness. The day had drained us both, and there was a gentle comfort in simply being there, no demands, no urgency. We talked about little things, the kind of quiet exchange that felt like home. I don't know when sleep claimed us, but when my eyes fluttered open at 6 a.m., the bed beside me was empty, the sheets cool where she'd been. Later that day, the 4 of us, Helen, Janet, Mildred, and I, piled into a car and drove to a retreat estate in Heersbach. The countryside unfolded around us, rolling hills and golden fields stretching under a pale March sky. When we arrived, David and his wife Marilyn greeted us with open arms, their warmth as inviting as the sprawling house behind them. The Stones were there too, along with Kira Wilson and Ment Etheridge, 2 of David's team members immersed in some ambitious project. 3 more colleagues would trickle in later, they said. Millant, a statuesque woman with cascading golden hair, caught Mildred's eye immediately. She exuded a poised elegance, while Kira, younger and edgier with dark hair and tattoos snaking up her arms, had a raw, magnetic charm. The 2 women clicked instantly, often seen whispering and laughing together, a tight-knit duo supporting each other's every move. Mildred gravitated toward them. And soon the trio vanished down one of the estate's long, echoing hallways, their voices fading into the distance. I introduced Helen to David and Marilyn, watching as the three women, Helen, Janet, and Marilyn, drifted off in another direction, their laughter trailing behind them. Left alone with David, I couldn't resist a playful jab. "Three women, Tom," he chuckled, shaking his head. "I only started with one." I winked back, a smirk tugging at my lips. "Yeah, I know, I've been there too." Janet had once hinted at David and Marilyn's past, a tapestry of colorful, dramatic threads she'd only sketched in vague strokes. I didn't pry, some stories weren't mine to unravel, but I knew Pam, another figure in their orbit, had been close to David for years. She was family to them now, a bond forged through time and trust. I made a mental note to coax the full tale out of David over drinks one night, curiosity flickering in the back of my mind. Dinner unfolded in a grand room, its walls adorned with old paintings and flickering candlelight. The table groaned under a feast, platters of roast meat, bowls of steaming vegetables, and glasses clinking with rich wine. By the time we finished, the room buzzed with easy laughter and the glow of good company. The rest of David's team arrived. Joined by a handful of guests from his new German branch, their accents lilting through the air. Marilyn sidled up to me as I lingered near the edge of the gathering. "Tom, you doing okay tonight?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. She and Helen had hit it off, though she just escaped the orbit of two older German gentlemen vying for their attention. "Come on. Let's step out to the patio, I could use some fresh air," she suggested. I followed her outside, the cool night wrapping around us as I glanced back at Helen. She was holding court with the two men. Drinks in hand, her laughter ringing out like a melody. Marilyn's question came gently but cut deep. "Tom, you've been divorced a couple of years now, right?" I nodded. The weight of time pressing down, 2 years that felt like a lifetime. "Oh, that's probably a good sign you still care for her, don't you?" "You don't have to answer, I can see it on your face." I smiled faintly, her perceptiveness disarming me. "Of course I still care," I admitted, my voice low. 25 years together, you don't just switch that off." She returned my smile, her eyes glistening with understanding. "Oh, I get that, Tom. David and I have been through what you're feeling. The divorce was brutal, and even when I tried to walk away, he found a way to hold on. It's hard to picture now, but my life was a mess too." A tear slipped down her cheek, and I rested my arm around her shoulder, a quiet gesture of solidarity. "Marilyn, our stories aren't over yet," I said, my tone steady. "Until they are, I don't rule anything out. A few months ago, I thought I'd settled things with someone, Janet Carr, actually. Now look at me, surrounded by 3 women. Life's a damn puzzle, isn't it?" We both laughed, the absurdity of it lightening the moment. "Enjoy it while you can," she advised, and I tucked that wisdom away, knowing it was worth holding on to. Wandering through the party, I spotted Janet and Helen mingling with a cluster of German guys, their camaraderie flowing as freely as the drinks. Janet caught my eye and excused herself, gliding over with a teasing grin. "Feeling a little jealous, Tom?" she asked, her tone light but sharp. "Does it show?" She laughed softly. "Just a little. But tell me, are you feeling this way for me or for Helen?" I tilted my head, considering. "Can it be both?" Her eyes sparkled with mischief. "Oh, that could get interesting. I'm in a particularly good mood tonight, are you planning to spend some time with me later? It's been weeks since we caught up, and I could use the company." I hesitated, glancing at the men she'd left behind. "I'd like that, Janet, but what about them? How you let them down easy. And Helen, is she feeling the same pull? She waved a hand dismissively. Her playful edge unwavering. Oh, Tom, Helen's only got eyes for you. She might enjoy the attention, but she won't cross any lines, unless she's had too much to drink, maybe. I'll be kind to them. But go on, enjoy yourself. I'll find you later, might even have a surprise up my sleeve. Her fingers brushed my arm, a promise lingering in her touch, and I knew the night was far from over. Helen was still deep in conversation with her admirers, oblivious to the drink Janet had slipped into her hand. Mildred, meanwhile, was engrossed with Millant and Kira. The trio now joined by two young men, recent college grads, I later learned, fresh hires at David's company, Phoenix. Their excitement crackled in the air. And Mildred shot me a quick glance before diving back into her chat. I roamed the estate, its vastness unfolding around me, 2 guest houses, an apartment above the garage. All nestled within a beautifully aged home. The owners, a kindly older couple, kept to their garage perch, rarely seen but ever present. In a quiet hallway, I stumbled upon a billiards room. Its dark wood walls lined with shelves of liquor. A fridge hummed in the corner, stocked with cold drinks, and I set up the table for a solo game. David wandered in moments later, his grin widening. Nice start. Do you play 9-ball? Whenever I can, I shot back, and we settled into a match, wagering €20 since we were in Europe. He was good, better than me, I'd admit, but we both held our own. The clack of balls punctuating our banter. The night deepened, and soon Marilyn swept in with Janet and Helen in tow. The other women lingered in the study, still caught up in their games. I'd later hear that Millant was happily married, a devoted wife and mother to 2 little girls. Her life anchored by a husband who adored her, a detail that quietly dashed the hopes of the 2 men circling her earlier. By midnight, the party began to unravel, and I slipped upstairs to my room. After a quick shower, I swapped my clothes for something soft and simple, the day's weight melting away. When I returned to the bedroom, the harsh lights had been dimmed, replaced by the warm flicker of candles on the side tables. 2 women lay sprawled across my bed, Helen and Janet, their laughter bubbling up as they lounged together, relaxed and playful. Their presence filled the room with a carefree energy, and we spent hours wrapped in each other's company, the night stretching into a haze of shared moments. Morning crept in, pulling me from a deep sleep. Helen was there beside me, her smile soft and knowing. Our eyes met, and in that quiet exchange, she made me feel seen, cherished in a way that lingered. Afterward, she nestled close, and I drifted off again, lulled by her warmth. When I woke next, the bed was empty, sunlight spilling through open windows. A familiar figure stood near the dresser, her back to me, brushing her hair in the golden glow. It was Helen, a sight I'd known for decades. I opened my mouth to speak, but she pressed a finger to her lips, silencing me with a gentle shake of her head. "Don't say anything," she whispered. "It just seemed right." She turned, slipping into a light blue dress, shorter than her usual style, and flashed a fleeting smile before stepping out the door and down the hall. I lay there a moment longer, the weight of her words settling over me, before rising to join David and Marilyn downstairs, the day stretching out with quiet possibility. The afternoon sun dipped low in the sky as Helen, Janet, Mildred, and I soaked in the last moments of our time together, the air buzzing with the warmth of good company. Our laughter lingered as we reluctantly piled into the car, leaving behind a day filled with shared stories and carefree joy. The drive back to Heidelberg was a short, delightful journey. The rolling hills outside the window painted with the golden hues of late afternoon. Inside, the mood was light and buoyant, Janet and Helen nestled in the back seat, their voices weaving a tapestry of giddy conversation that bounced off the car's interior. Mildred, perched confidently in the front beside me, turned the ride into a playful quiz, tossing out questions about cocktails and silly parlor games. Her teasing tone sparked bursts of laughter from the back, and I couldn't help but grin at how effortlessly the three of them clicked. Helen, especially, surprised me with her encyclopedic knowledge of those quirky games, her sharp wit shining through as she fired back answers with a smug little smile. We pulled up to my place in no time, the car's engine humming to a stop as the day's energy settled into a cozy fatigue. I popped the trunk and lent Mildred a hand with her bags, her grateful nod warming me as we shuffled inside. Janet and Helen trailed behind, their chatter softening into a comfortable hum. After a simple dinner, nothing fancy, just enough to fill the quiet, we migrated to my apartment. The living room felt snug and inviting, the couch beckoning us with its worn-in cushions. I plopped down, patting the spots on either side of me with a grin. "Come here, you two," I said, draping my arms around Janet and Helen as they settled in close. Their warmth pressed against me, and for a moment, I just breathed it in. "Okay," I started, my voice low and curious, "what's going on here?" They exchanged a quick glance, their eyes sparkling with mischief before dissolving into soft laughter. As if I'd asked the most absurd thing in the world. Helen broke the silence first, her tone playful yet tender. "Janet's going to steal you away for some quality time tonight," she said, tipping her head toward her room down the hall, while I sink into my bed and let those cozy blankets swallow me whole. Her smile was easy, content, like she'd already pictured herself drifting off. Janet chimed in, her voice bubbling with excitement. "And after that, we'll all crash. Then tomorrow, you're off to work, and Helen and I are plotting a little escapade. We'll be gone a few days, hope that's okay with you." She paused, her eyes searching mine. "Mildred's sticking around, though. She'll keep you company while we're off adventuring. That cool?" My brow must have furrowed because Janet leaned closer, her hand brushing my arm. "Don't overthink it, Tom. We know about Mildred, she told us everything. Actually, she checked with us first. And we're totally fine with it. You should know that by now." Helen nodded, her expression softening into something earnest. "Tom, all I care about is you being happy, being you. Whatever happens. Whether it's now or when we're all back together, it'll work itself out." Her words hung there, simple but heavy, and before I could respond, she leaned over, pressing a gentle kiss to my cheek, a quiet gesture that carried more than words could. Then she was up, slipping off to her room with a little wave, leaving the air lighter somehow. Janet didn't waste a second. She slid into my lap, her arms looping around my neck, fingers brushing my shoulders. Finally, she murmured, her breath warm against my ear, "Just us." We melted into the couch, cuddling close as the day's exhaustion caught up. After a while, I took her hand, leading her to my room. The bed welcomed us like an old friend, and we climbed in, too tired to fuss with anything more than kicking off our shoes. Sleep tugged at us fast, but not before we tangled ourselves together, her head nestled against my chest. Hours later, around 2 a.m. we stirred, groggy, blinking into the dimness. A quick stumble to the bathroom, then back to bed, where we lay whispering in the stillness. "Tom," Janet said, her voice soft but steady. "When we're like this, I feel closer to you than anyone. I don't want that to stop. You don't have to pull back from Helen, though. You're the only one who holds me like this. And if you ever want something different, just say it, okay?" I chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Oh, Janet, you sweet thing." She grinned, playful now. "I'm serious, I don't want you to stop with Helen, or even Mildred. I like her, you know. Wouldn't mind a little moment with her myself," she teased, her eyes glinting. "And Helen, she's like Pam to me. A sister." We both have you in our own way, and that's special. But you know why I'm okay with you and her? It's beautiful when you're together. She told me how you are. How you give each other what you need. You and Mildred have something different, something unique, and honestly, I'm a little jealous. Helen is too. Just stay here with me, I murmured, pulling her closer. I'm good with all of it. Let's sleep, you've got a big day tomorrow. Leave me your schedule so I can find you if I need to. She nodded, and soon we drifted off again. The quiet wrapping around us like a blanket. Morning came too fast. Janet and Helen handed me a scribbled itinerary, 6 days weaving through Germany, the Netherlands, and a pit stop in Belgium. I felt a pang of envy, picturing them laughing through cobblestone streets while I'd be stuck at work. But Mildred stepped up, taking on more at the office, her quiet competence shining through. I saw something in her, potential, maybe more, and it hit me how tangled my life had gotten. There was no hiding it, Mildred and I were something. She stayed at my place every night while the others were gone, her presence steady and familiar. Word must have spread at work, Ingrid definitely knew, and I'd bet Margaret had her suspicions. Hans and a few others probably caught on too. If I pushed Mildred up the ladder, it'd stir trouble, no question. During my weekly call with Bill, my boss, he tossed out a lifeline. The operations manager in Sonoma was pregnant, stepping back after the baby came, 5 months to find a replacement. It could be Mildred's spot, but I'd need to clear it with Janet and Helen first. When I laid it out for them later, their excitement caught me off guard. To back up a bit, my place had become a revolving door of faces, David and Marilyn off to Italy for work. Leaving Ment and Kira behind in Germany. Ment zipped back every couple weeks, crashing in Mildred's spare room. She and Kira were thick as thieves, which threw me at first. But Mildred swore it was platonic, they shared everything but that. Still, the women were knitting into a tight crew. Dietrich even ribbed me about it, calling them my squad, 5 of them. 6 when Ingrid popped by. I pitched the job to Mildred, and she asked for time to mull it over. Fair enough, we had months. I stressed it was a big role, not a favor born from whatever we had. To keep it clean, she'd report to Bill, who was fine with it once I filled him in discreetly. Janet and Helen rolled back into town after stretching their trip 3 extra weeks, Janet fretting over her mom, Helen sealing a condo deal. Left solo again, though Mildred still hung around. They promised to return in a month. Life in Germany chugged along like that, Janet and Helen popping in. Me eventually flying back to Sonoma with Mildred to introduce her to the Omega team once she took the job. That's when we had the talk. Things couldn't stay blurry between us. Not if we'd worked together stateside. Marriage wasn't on the table, neither of us wanted it, so nature sorted it out. She met someone during training in Sonoma, a guy she clicked with. She was upfront about it, and soon we had a bittersweet goodbye. One last hurrah, a weekend at an Italian villa, all rolling hills and golden light. We came back friends. Keeping that chapter to ourselves. Her new guy knew we were close but didn't need the footnotes. My Germany stint wound down eventually. I tapped Margaret to take the helm. Hashing it out over a long night of wine and work talk. If she floundered, I'd find someone else. The office threw a big send-off for me and Mildred, her heading home too. I'd shaped the Heidelberg setup to mirror Sonoma's, and folks seemed pleased. We landed late, greeted by Mildred's new beau, a chill winery manager with a firm handshake. They peeled off. And I hit my condo, wherein had outdone herself, place spotless, fridge stocked with my favorite German brews. Settling back took days, but I craved a breather. Janet knew I was around. But we hadn't linked up. So I strolled to her place, only to freeze when a stranger opened the door. Janet's eyes met mine from the living room, surprise, then something else. I didn't own her. But envy prickled anyway. I mumbled I'd catch her later, grabbed my Porsche keys, and peeled out toward San Rafael. Called and, dinner with her and Jason? They had plans with her mom. But she insisted, Dad, join us at Yetwa. It's been too long. Helen was coming too, first family sit-down in years. I couldn't say no. Janet rang before I got there, still good, she said. But I felt adrift, chasing something I couldn't name, the road humming beneath me as I drove. The afternoon sun streamed through the wide windows of Anne's cozy living room, casting golden patches across the hardwood floor as we settled into her plush armchairs. Our conversation quickly turned to the business, soft tech. My brainchild that had been sprinting forward at a dizzying pace. I'd been itching to sit down with Anne and Jason for weeks, my mind buzzing with thoughts about the company's trajectory. Soft tech was thriving, its reputation growing like wildfire, but I couldn't shake a gnawing unease. We'd poured so much into biotech, too much, maybe. The industry was a chaotic swirl of potential. But lately, some biotech firms were slamming on the brakes, their eyes glued to the horizon for new FDA regulations that could shift everything. Biotech was the beating heart of soft tech. And I felt a quiet dread creeping in, whispering that we'd tethered ourselves too tightly to its unpredictable pulse. I wanted us to stretch our wings. To dip our toes into general manufacturing and carve out a bolder footprint in the broader tech landscape. The idea thrilled me. But it also made my stomach twist with uncertainty. Could we pull it off? Later, at Anne's gentle nudge, Jason strolled through the door, his easy grin lighting up the room. The three of us sprawled out in her living room, an impromptu meeting unfolding over steaming mugs of coffee. Anne's kids, sharp, curious minds, drifted in and out. Their voices bubbling with insights about biotech. They knew the equipment and software inside out. Their chatter brimming with the kind of raw understanding that only comes from living and breathing the customer's world. I envied their clarity, their unshakable grasp of what people needed. Breaking into new territory, though? That felt like stepping onto a tightrope without a net. My palms grew clammy just thinking about it, but I couldn't let fear hold us back. I leaned forward. My voice steady but urgent. Look, we've been at this for 3 years. Our products are solid, people trust us. But we can't just sit here. We've got to push harder, grow bigger. We could dream up new products, stretch our market wider with what we've already got. I say we do both. Jason. It's time to dive back into product development, get someone to handle production so you can focus. I'm not saying I've got all the answers, you two know this ship better than anyone, but we need to be fearless. They stared at me, wide-eyed, like I'd just asked them to leap off a cliff blindfolded. Maybe I had. Anne's brow furrowed, her fingers tightening around her mug, while Jason shifted in his seat, his usual confidence flickering. They'd grown cozy. I realized, too cozy, watching soft tech hum along without seeing the storm clouds gathering in the distance. My chest tightened with frustration, but I held their gaze, willing them to feel the urgency pulsing through me. They didn't say much then, just nodded faintly, but later, after I'd left, the wheels started turning. Soft tech brought on a new production manager, a wiry, no-nonsense guy with a knack for keeping things humming, and landed a slew of contracts to revamp light manufacturing ops up and down the West Coast. It was a win, a quiet triumph. But as we wrapped up that day, my mind was already drifting elsewhere. Dinner beckoned, and we piled into Jason's car. The three of us laughing about nothing as we headed to meet Helen at a little spot downtown. I hadn't seen her in ages, and the surprise of it hit me like a jolt when Anne mentioned she'd be there. My stomach did a weird flip, excitement, sure, but laced with something heavier. When we walked in, though, the air shifted. Helen sat at a corner table. Radiant in a buttery yellow dress that hugged her curves just right, her hair swept up in a way that made my breath catch. She smelled faintly of that jasmine perfume I used to love. The one that always tugged at old memories. But she wasn't alone. A man, tall, polished, not the real estate guy I'd half expected, sat across from her, his hand resting too casually on the table. My chest tightened, a sharp pang slicing through me. I'd felt a flicker of jealousy earlier that week when I'd spotted Janet across town, but this? This was a full-on blaze. Helen's eyes flicked up, locking with mine, and her face froze, a deer caught in headlights. I tried to plaster on a smile, but it faltered. She'd always been able to read me like an open book. My sadness must have been scrawled across my features, raw and unmistakable. I leaned toward Anne, my voice a low rasp. Did you know she was meeting someone? Anne's head shook almost imperceptibly, her lips pressing into a thin line. Helen stood, smoothing her dress nervously, and introduced us. The guy, some neighbor from her condo building, offered a polite nod. But the air thickened with awkwardness. I caught Helen's gaze again, and the hurt in my chest flared. I couldn't sit there, pretending. Hey, I think I'll step outside for a minute, I mumbled. My voice barely steady. I shouldn't have crashed this, came on too short notice. I'll call you guys later. I shot Anne and Jason a look, hoping they'd get it. Jason's brow creased. But Anne's eyes softened with understanding. As I turned to go, she mouthed, "I'm sorry. I love you, and it hit me like a punch. Outside, the cool evening air slapped my face, grounding me as I paced the sidewalk. I'd ridden with Anne and Jason, so now I was stranded, my thoughts spinning. I lingered there, hands shoved deep in my pockets, watching the restaurant's warm glow spill onto the street. Then Anne appeared, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Can we walk?" she asked, her voice trembling as she looped her arm through mine. We drifted along the quiet street, her grip tightening. "No need to cry, Anne," I said, forcing calm into my tone. "I can handle this." She shook her head, clinging closer. "She cares about you, so much. She's a mess right now, torn up inside, and he's clueless about how to help. Jason's trying to keep the peace, but you've got to talk to her. She didn't expect you here. Please, just talk to her. She got all dolled up for someone, not us. I picked that dress with her, you know. I wanted to see her shine in it." Her words tumbled out, raw and pleading. I looked down at my daughter, her face flushed with emotion, and something in me softened. "Okay," I sighed. We turned back, my steps heavier now. I slumped onto a bench near the entrance, letting the night settle around me. Minutes ticked by before the condo guy stepped out, his expression sheepish. "Mr. Davis, I'm sorry about tonight. I wouldn't have come if I'd known how she felt, or that you'd be here. It was just dinner. Please, take my apology." He stuck out his hand, and I shook it, my jaw tight. "It's fine. I might have done the same in your shoes." He nodded and slipped away. Then Helen emerged, her heels clicking softly as she sank beside me. She turned, her eyes searching mine, deep and unguarded. "Tom. When are you coming back to me? When will you say I'm yours again? We both know it's coming, I just need to know when. Am I asking too much?" Her voice was steady now, a faint smile tugging at her lips. I pulled her close, my arms wrapping around her gently. "Where do you want to go?" I murmured. "Home," she whispered back, "but let's eat first." I stood, flagged down the restaurant staff, and explained our messy little saga. They were kind, moved us to a quieter corner where the hum of other diners faded into a soft blur. We ate together. The four of us, me, Helen, and Jason, laughing and talking like a family for the first time in over 3 years. The knot in my chest loosened, replaced by a warmth I hadn't felt in ages. Before we left, I pressed a generous tip into the waiter's hand, then the manager's, thanking them for their grace. Back at Anne's, I hugged her and Jason goodbye. My voice thick as I told them I'd call. Then I slid into the driver's seat, Helen beside me, guiding me toward her place. When we arrived, I eased her out of that yellow dress, my fingers lingering as we sank onto her new couch. The night unfolded in a rush of closeness, urgent, tender, real. Afterward, lying there with her head on my chest, her legs slung over mine, I felt the weight of what we'd shared. She'd left me once, but now, in the quiet, that seemed like a lifetime ago. Morning crept in, soft and golden. I padded to her kitchen, whipping up breakfast as she stretched awake. Over coffee, I grinned at her. We're taking a trip, a little escape before work swallows me again. She lit up, and we packed 2 bags, tossing them into the car before winding our way to Sonoma. The drive was easy, the scenery blurring past as we traded stories and silences. At the rental, I hauled both bags inside but told her to unpack just one. We'll buy whatever else we need, I said, mirroring her with my own light load. She looked tired, happy, but tired, and I wanted her to feel cared for, treasured. It mattered to me, more than I could explain. From then on, every moment together felt like peeling back layers, discovering each other anew. We roamed the coast, stopping wherever the mood struck, Eureka one night, then Portland the next, crashing at the downtown Marriott. There, under the soft glow of city lights, I held her close, taking my time, letting every touch say what words couldn't. Portland unfolded like a gift, food trucks with smoky, spicy delights, quirky shops tucked into narrow streets, the waterfront stretching out under a crisp sky. I'd never lingered there before, and exploring it with Helen felt like claiming a piece of the world together. After a few days, we hopped an Alaska Air flight to Anchorage, soaking in the wild, rugged beauty for a couple of days before looping back to Portland. That night, over dinner, I set 2 things on the table. The letter she'd left me when she walked out years ago, and my grandmother's ring. Helen, read this, I said, my voice low but firm. If you think that woman, the one who wrote this, is gone for good, take it to the fireplace and let it burn. She unfolded the paper, her fingers trembling slightly, and read in silence. Then she stood, crossed the room, and paused, glancing back at me before letting it flutter into the flames. When she returned, I pushed the ring toward her. I'm not the same Tom you left. I've grown, changed, lived a lot. But I love you. Always have, always will. If you feel it too, put this back on. Her eyes welled up, and without a word, she slipped the ring onto her finger, nestling it beside her wedding band. She cried softly as I took her hand, my thumb brushing over her knuckles. The next morning, we packed up, tracing our way back to Sonoma with a stop in Eureka. It was late when we rolled in, and I asked if she wanted to stay or head to her place. Stay, she murmured, and we grilled dinner instead of going out, the smoky scent filling the air. I hadn't mentioned seeing Janet that afternoon, hadn't planned to, but Janet must have texted her, because Helen turned to me, wine bottle in hand. Tom, can I visit Janet for a bit? We need to talk. Might be a while. I nodded, and she grabbed a Cabernet from the rack before disappearing out the door. I figured I'd settle in with a movie, but my phone buzzed, a text from Kira Wilson. Asterisk heard you were back. Come join us DNTN Joe's, asterisk trouble whispered in the back of my mind, but I scribbled a note for Helen, left my key where she'd see it, and headed out. At Joe's, Kira waved me over, her black mesh tank top catching the dim light. She was with Pam, Nigel, a stranger, mild ride, and Marilyn, all shifting to make room. Kira looked different here, loose, unguarded. Like she'd shed her usual armor. I slid into the booth, the noise of the bar wrapping around us, and let the night pull me in. She stood there. A vibrant splash of individuality in a world that often felt too gray, her tattooed skin gleaming under the dim bar lights. The piercings, small, defiant studs and rings, dotted her eyebrows, nose, and lips, each one a quiet rebellion that amplified her unique flair. A streak of purple hair tumbled down one side of her head, vivid and bold, catching the eye like a brushstroke of paint on a blank canvas. Even with all these changes, I could still see it, the same breathtaking beauty I'd first glimpsed years ago in Heidelberg, glowing beneath the surface of her daring exterior. It warmed me, that flicker of recognition, like finding an old photograph in a dusty attic. Mride approached then, her steps light but purposeful, her face breaking into a smile that felt like sunlight after a long rain. She greeted me with a hug that lingered just a moment longer than usual, her arms wrapping around me with a tenderness that stirred something deep inside. Then she slid into the seat between Nigel and me, her presence filling the space with an effortless energy. I leaned toward her, curiosity tugging at me. "Where's the new guy?" I asked, my voice casual but tinged with genuine interest. Her smile faltered, just for a second, before she shrugged. "It didn't work out," she said, her tone clipped, like a door gently but firmly shut. I could sense the weight behind her words, the unspoken story she wasn't ready to unravel. I didn't push, instinct told me she'd open up when the time was right, and I'd learned long ago that patience often revealed more than probing ever could. Marilyn broke the silence, her voice cutting through the hum of the bar. "Tom, do you know where Janet and Helen are?" she asked, her fingers already dancing across her phone screen, typing with a focus that suggested she was juggling a dozen thoughts at once. I shifted in my seat, hesitant to dive too deep into details. "Helen's over at Janet's place tonight," I replied, keeping it simple. I didn't want to bother them, but I sent a text to let her know we're here. My eyes flicked to Marilyn, who barely looked up from her phone. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she fired off another message. Just then, a fresh round of beers landed on the table, the clink of glass against wood a welcome interruption. We all raised our drinks, the amber liquid catching the light, and toasted to good luck, our voices blending in a brief, hearty chorus. Marilyn wasn't done, though. She lifted her glass again, her expression softening into something celebratory. "To Margot and Cynthia Hegland," she announced, "the twins born to Pam and Nigel." The words hit me like a jolt of electricity. Twins? I'd known Pam was expecting, but 2 babies? That was news I hadn't seen coming. A ripple of surprise passed through me, followed by a swell of joy as I joined the others in a cheer. Our glasses clinking again in a symphony of shared delight. The table buzzed with laughter and chatter, snippets of congratulations floating around like confetti. Before long, the door swung open, and Janet and Helen breezed in, their arrival shifting the night's rhythm. We shuffled chairs and dragged another table over, the scrape of wood against the floor mingling with the bar's low roar. Janet slid in close to me, her breath warm against my ear as she whispered, "We'll talk later, don't drink too much." Her fingers brushed my cheek, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver down my spine. Soft and deliberate. Helen, meanwhile, flashed a wide, radiant smile, her eyes sparkling with something unspoken. I hoped they'd walked here, the idea of them driving after a night like this gnawed at me, though I didn't voice it. The evening stretched on, the bar alive with clinking glasses and bursts of laughter. Most of the group was staying at Janet's parents' sprawling house, a cozy refuge just outside town. While Mride had opted for the Four Sisters Inn in Sonoma, a charming little place with ivy creeping up its walls and a quiet elegance that suited her. Everyone seemed caught up in the moment, their faces glowing with the kind of carefree happiness that only a night like this could bring. Everyone, that is, except me, Kira, and Mride. I caught Mride's eye across the table. She wore a sly grin, a hint of mischief dancing there that made me wonder what she was plotting. Helen leaned in again, her voice a conspiratorial whisper against the din. "Tom, when it's time to go. Janet and I have something special planned for you." She punctuated it with a wink, playful and teasing, her eyes glinting with promise. I glanced at Mride again, her grin widening as if she were in on the secret. My pulse quickened, a mix of anticipation and curiosity swirling in my chest. When the night finally wound down, I found myself flanked by Helen and Janet, their arms looped through mine as we stepped out into the cool night air. Helen tugged Mride along too, her laughter ringing out like bells as we made our way to my condo. It felt like a strange echo of that night in Heidelberg months ago, a memory laced with warmth and a touch of reckless abandon. Inside, Helen gave me a playful shove onto the couch, dropping down beside me with a grin that could melt steel. The others hovered nearby, their eyes bright with interest. "Tom," she said, her tone light but charged with intent, "you and I are a pair, and tonight's going to be fun, if we all agree." She looked around, gauging the room, then back at me. I didn't have words, just a nod, my mind racing to keep up with her energy. Helen gestured to Janet and Mride, who stepped forward, flanking me as Helen took center stage. Music suddenly filled the room, something upbeat and infectious, and the three of them began to dance, their movements fluid and joyful, a celebration of the moment. Janet cupped Mride's face in her hands, a tender gesture that drew a laugh from Mride, her eyes crinkling with delight. When the dance wound down, I poured Helen a glass of wine, the deep red liquid swirling in the glass, and mixed myself a rum and coke, the ice clinking softly. "Welcome home, Helen," I said, raising my drink. She smiled, a quiet warmth settling between us. Our relationship had shifted since then, years had passed, and the strange, beautiful arrangement we'd stumbled into had reshaped us. Helen and I never remarried. But she lived with me now in the condo, though we were already dreaming of a house in the countryside, a fresh start with wide fields and open skies. Janet had found someone new. A connection that wasn't exclusive yet but carried a spark of possibility. After long talks, the three of us, Helen, Janet, and I, had decided to stay close, bound by a friendship forged in the fires of those wild nights. I never asked about their escapades in Heersbach, some mysteries were better left to drift in the haze of imagination. Mride remained a cornerstone of our lives, her presence as vital as ever. 9 months after that night, she'd given birth to my son, Thomas Will Davis, a sturdy, bright-eyed boy who carried my name and her spirit. She sometimes shared our bed when Helen permitted, which was more often than not, her laughter filling the condo like a melody. Thomas lived with Mride for now, but as the country house took shape, a sturdy main building and a cozy cottage on the property, I planned to ask her to join us, either in the house or the cottage, whichever she preferred. I'd set up a trust for Thomas, ensuring his future, and despite Mride's protests, I'd created a fund for her too, a safety net she couldn't refuse forever. Helen had fallen head over heels for Thomas, doting on him with a fierceness that surprised even her. She'd scoop him up the moment he cried, cradling him close. Following some German tradition Mride insisted on. Mride wanted him to call me Papa, and Helen would be Nana, a simple choice to keep things clear for him as he grew. One day, we'd sit him down and explain our unconventional family, but for now, we let him bask in the love that surrounded him. Jason and Anne, meanwhile, were carving their own paths. Their business was thriving, and both had dipped their toes into new relationships. Anne and I had talked once about her mother's rigid views on marriage and trust, seeing us together. even in our tangled way, seemed to soften her cynicism. She'd met a kind young man, steady and earnest, who I could tell was smitten. Jason, too, had found someone, Julie, a warm, witty woman who'd captured his heart. He confided in me that he planned to propose soon, though he wanted to meet her parents first. I could picture David and Marilyn pulling him aside, their voices low and serious, laying out their hopes for their daughter over a long, heartfelt talk. Omega, the company I'd poured so much into, was growing fast. With Bill retiring next year, the board had tapped me to step up as chairman alongside my CEO role, a daunting leap, but one I was ready for. It might mean rethinking Ride's work setup, but I'd cross that bridge when I came to it. Back in Heidelberg, Margaret was thriving, and Ingrid had settled down with an auto mechanic, her wild days behind her. Softtech kept pushing into new markets. And the kids, and Jason, were learning to navigate the cutthroat world of business. Did it prepare them for the messiness of their personal lives? I thought so. It didn't mean and would never stray or that Julie wouldn't catch someone else's eye if she and Jason tied the knot, it just meant they'd be sharper, more attuned to the currents that could pull a relationship off course. If I'd helped them see that, I could rest easy. Was I still the loyal, steady man I'd been before life got loud and chaotic? No, not really. But I couldn't help thinking that if I'd tended to my marriage with more care, talked to Helen with more honesty, we might have held on to something simpler, something joyful. That wouldn't have been so bad. Still, here we were, flawed, tangled, and somehow whole.